Good evening. Welcome to the Township Board of Trustees meeting for Tuesday, January 22nd. Ms. Lane, would you lead us in the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Before we get started, I just want to voice our concern. We had an officer in Saginaw Township that was severely wounded earlier today, Chief, was it? And it's pretty close to home, and we're having police officers shot, near us in our surrounding community. So appreciate our first responders and the risk they put themselves at. So keep him and his family in thoughts tonight. With that, I'm going to ask for approval of the consent agenda and the regular agenda.
So moved, Mr. Chair.
Support.
Okay.
Discussion?
Discussion. Mr. Answer?
So in going through the board packet, it was not clear to me that we have a precise beginning and end date for the on-base annual renewal. So I would like to request that we postpone that to the next meeting when we can have the dates clearly on the invoice and et cetera.
Right. And maybe we can actually, if you don't mind, talk about that a little bit, just so everybody knows what's going on with that. If we can make that, I don't know, item, let's make that item E on operational issues. Just want to have a brief discussion on that. And then also, while we're discussing this, I'd like to ask the board to consider moving item D on operational issues. We're going to approve a motion, or we're going to consider a motion to approve Mark Kilmer as our township representative on the McFarland Library Board. And I'd like to see if we can't move that up to, where would you suggest, Mr. Lemata?
I like it at the end, so Mr. Kilmer has to stick around.
You could really pull it up to the first of your operational issues and just make it item A and push the other ones down, and that would.
Let's do that. We'll just move that up to item A. Okay. If the makers of that motion in a second would approve those changes.
So I would like to move the operational issue to have Mr. Kilmer bumped up to the top of the A, then have A1 as motion.
And then discuss
Support.
the contract. Did you make the motion?
I made the motion and Mr.
You
Massey
approve the
approved
change?
it. Yes, sir.
Mr. Massey?
Yes.
Okay. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, with that, we'll open the floor for citizen comments, and we'll start here on my left side of the room, work our way back. Anybody named Mr. Kilmer, or moving back to the second row, third row? Care to wish to make a comment? We'll go over to the right side of the room. Anybody on the right side care to make a comment? And then to the back of the room. Mr. Bush. Good evening, Mr. Ert.
Good evening, Ed Ert, 7212 Porter Road. Tonight we're going to hear about a study from MGT Financial about the fire department. I want to talk about what's not in that study. I'm sure it's a great study. I'm sure it's going to tell us what the costs are and where we're at. But what's not in that study is our partnership. I'm sure it's not there. I don't think it addresses our ability to work things out with our partner. Our ability to, work together. Our common goals. Those are where we're having problems with our partner. And what does each partner bring to the table to benefit the other partner? I don't see any benefits. How do we complement each other? By being partners. Those are questions that go through my head and I just don't seem to find answers for them. For 2 years we've been push-pulling about this financial in the fire department. The fire department does a good job. Funding's there. It's our partnership that seems to have a problem. Soon tonight, we're gonna hear this presentation, and I'm sure City Council again will disagree. But we'll see. Funding is not our major problem here. I've said it a couple of years ago for quite some time. The problem is the partnership. I don't see how we can make this partnership work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hurt. Mr. Bush? Good evening.
Good evening. My name is Jim Bush, 5243 Lethbridge Road. This is a different type of comment. I want to ask the board to think about your agenda and possibly moving the citizen comment to either later or maybe having a second one. It's difficult to, especially tonight, I'm going to hear a lot of great information, but if I have questions, how do I ask those questions? If I could ask them towards the end, it would be helpful. So I just ask you to think about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bush. Mr. Hurt? And any other comment? Okay, we'll close citizen comment, and we are going to move to privileged presentations. And with that, I would welcome Mr. Gordon Stryker of MGT Consulting to discuss the findings of our Fire Department Financial Operations Study. Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm going to bring your presentation up right now.
Does everybody get the presentation on their computer? Or are you gonna have to look up the sides?
Trying to get my... Does Murphy's Law say that...
And you tested it.
Okay, there we go. There we
That's
go.
it.
That's
Good
it.
My name's Gordon Stryker, and I'm with MGT, and we did a study for the township and for the city with regards to the Grand Blanc Fire Department. And I'm here to give you the sum and substance of the study and offer an opportunity for you to ask questions if you have any questions about it. So if you want to go on to the next page. What we're going to be doing, and I apologize, I'm getting a frog in my throat, so.
Would you like a water, Mr. Stryker?
I've actually got my pop-ups.
Okay,
I'm all set.
all right.
Thank you, appreciate it. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the background of the study, the costing methodology, the existing funding scenarios, funding alternatives, and the cost-based performance that we did. So I want to start by talking a little bit about the background, MGT, who we are. MGT is a consulting company that has been providing consulting services since 1974. So if you've got your fingers out there, it's about 44 years that we've been around. We're incorporated down in the state of Florida, which of course a lot of us are wishing that we were down there right now probably. And we have got regional offices all around the country. We've got more than 3,500 clients that we're serving in about 50 states all around the country and in foreign countries. Most of the work that we provided are for municipalities similar to Grand Blanc Township and the city of Grand Blanc. Those are our primary clients that we have around the country, our municipalities like that. All the work that we did on this study was out of our Bay City office, Bay City, Michigan office. So, the study is a cost-based study. So we used actual audited financial expenditures from 2017. So be assured that the data that we have is actually been audited by your auditors and by the city auditors, and we use that data to come to the findings that we have done. For the cost allocation plans, the study that you have, there's two parts of the study. the actual, basically the executive summary of that I think everyone has. And also, you've got the big part of the study, which is the 2 cost allocation plans, which identifies the indirect costs for both the township and for the city. So that, and I'll get into a little bit about that. But I want to assure you that the indirect costs that we've identified, the statistics that we use are all sound statistics, similar to the number of employees that the county has, or not the county, but the township has, the number of employees the city has, transaction counts, square foot for buildings, things like that. So, background. The fire department provides fire protection services for the city of Grand Blanc and the township. You've always had a joint venture for several years, and currently you're splitting those expenditures at a rate of about 15.38% for the city and 84.62% for the township. Full cost of the services have not historically been calculated and distributed appropriately. And when I say full cost, what I'm talking about is the direct costs and the indirect costs. And the indirect costs are one of the costs that we were focusing on with this study. So the process that we took, both the indirect costs and the direct costs for the operation of the fire department were looked at. And again, we used 2017 audited financials for the study. We prepared indirect cost allocation plans for both the city and the township to determine the overhead rates. And when we're talking about the overhead rates for the indirect costs, we're looking at things like building costs. We're looking at equipment costs, costs for the township board, the finance department, superintendent, assessing, attorney's offices, clerks, IT, GIS, public building and grounds, the treasurer, insurance, and OPED costs. So all of these costs are costs that are funded through the general fund of both the municipalities and primarily the township, not really the city too much, and they're costs that are expended to support the operation of the fire department. And so what we've identified is those costs to help you identify what the full cost is of providing the fire department. This is in addition to the direct cost. We had great cooperation from the township. I had great cooperation from the fire department. Worked very good with the city also to get data for the cost allocation plan. So the next slide is the actual costing. So when you're looking at this slide here, and you've got the expenses, which include the indirect costs, the total is $1,566,000. The split of that was between the city and the township. As you can see, it was $240,000 and $1.3 million for the township. And the revenues that you received were $1.3 million, which basically caused a shortfall. The amount of money that was not covered was $188,000. And as I said, that number also includes the indirect costs for the township and for the city. So in the slide that you have here, it's showing what the indirect costs were, which was $94,000 for the city and $276,000 for the township.
I'm sorry, did you just say 94,000?
I'm sorry, it was 9,400. Thank you very much if I said 94,000. 9,400 for the city, for a total of 286,000 for the total indirect costs. So when you look at that and you take the indirect costs out, it shifts the shortfall a little bit, and it's showing that the city's shortfall is really $20,000, but for the township, you're actually putting in more than your share of $118,000. So that makes the surplus of $98,000. So one of the things that we did was we looked at alternative funding scenarios, and and so that we can get an idea of where you are today and what options that you have available to you, and maybe come up with some suggestions on how to better allocate the cost between the city and the township. So this is the scenario that is showing the equalized value, the state equalized value, and it's currently showing that the city is 15.65% and the township is 84%. And it's showing what the equalized value is for the city and for the township. The next one is that the census, if we want to look at, excuse me, allocating it based on population, the city would be 17.72%, and the township would be 82.28%. The other statistic that we looked at were the number of runs that the fire department has made. And again, this is all for 2017. And in the city, they made 127 runs. And for the township, they made 655 runs. And again, you can see the percentages. It's 16.27 and 83.73%. Square miles, another good indicator of the amount of space that the fire department is covering. We've got in the city 3.61 square miles, and in the township it's 32.7 square miles. This really is an indicator that shows how much space that you've got to get to from point A to point B when there is a fire. But for the township, you're at 90% of that in that category versus the 10%, almost the 10% for the city. Housing units is another good indicator because that's exactly what you're covering with the fire department. And in the city, there was 19%, and in the township, there's 80%. And so for a total of 19,837 housing units that are being protected by the fire department. And so what we're sort of recommending is that there's a hybrid. We looked at the taxable value, the state equalized value, population, and the number of runs. And so take those as those four factors and plug those in, and you get the average. And the city is 16.255, and township is 83.745. And again, what the current split is 15.38 for the city and 84.62 for the township. The other part of the study that we did was some performance comparisons. We looked at 5 different municipalities, and we ranked them with regards to some operational comparisons. And Grand Blanc Township obviously is the 6th one that's up there. When we were looking at the different townships or fire departments, some of the things that we were looking at were trying to get fire departments that are similar with regards to the Grand Blanc. And one of the similarities that we thought was kind of important was the number of stations that they had. If they had, Grand Blanc, obviously, fire department is operating out of 3 stations. And we thought that that was kind of significant because it's handling and you're staffing 3 stations, and it involves a little bit more administration with regards to coordination of the services and where you're going to go out to. So that was one of the main criteria that we used. And also we looked at the number of people that were employed, whether they're full-time or part-time, to staff the municipalities, fire departments. The one outlier that was in here, what we did was we came up with a list of what we thought were good recommended municipalities, fire departments, and then we threw it out to the city and we threw it out to the township. Township really didn't have any issues. The city really wanted to have Brighton as one of their, one of the 5, and so we included Brighton in there. The problem with Brighton that we saw is that they had 5 fire stations in it, and they also had a lot more staff in it. So it's going to bump up the expenditures, and you'll see that throughout some of the areas here. But looking at this, looking at expenditures, Grand Blanc, the total expenditures for 2017, ranked number 4. Looking at the next one, which is looking at the SEV values of the property, Grand Blanc Township ranked number 2. A lower ranking, as far in our eyes, is better than a higher ranking. The annual cost per resident in Grand Blanc is $29 compared to the other municipalities, fire departments. Again, that's phenomenal for you folks. The square miles covered, Grand Blanc is ranked number 3 with regards to the square miles that are covered and the dollar values. And then the annual cost per household is, you're ranked number 2 for that. So the findings that we had, that's the next slide there, the findings that we had was that, as I said, historically the costs for the fire department operations full cost has not been calculated. You've got the direct cost, but you weren't including the indirect cost, and we think that that's an important number that should be included in there. We've identified the indirect costs through separate cost allocation plans, and we've gone over the cost allocation plans with Dennis. We went over them with the city also, and got them both to sign off on the cost allocation plans. There were still some questions about some of the data in the cost allocation plans after they had been signed off on, but we feel pretty confident that the data is pretty solid in the cost plans. Full costs were identified based on audited expenditures, as I've said, for 2017. So based on the shared costs being split on the taxable values, the city's shortfall was $20,617, and the township surplus was $118,726. Based on the representative of the 4 factors that we recommend, which is the fair cost sharing, is when you do the average of them, that we think that it would be fair that the city share would be 16.25%, and the township share would be 83.74%. One of the things that we also looked at, and just the last bullet on here, is that there's the 5 comparative fire organizations, and that in the comparative organizations that we had in the study here, that's on the presentation also, is that Grand Blanc ranked in the top half or better as the performers. One of the other things that we looked at was there's a National Fire Protection Association agency that establishes response times for communities. And we looked at that as a measure also. We found that it's very difficult to, there's a lot of data out there, but when you start looking at the data, it's not the data that you want. And but there is a lot of data out there. And one of the things that we saw was that that NFPA organization sets standards, and they say that 90% of the responses for fires should be done within 9 minutes from dispatch to on scene. And when we did this, looked at the study and the data for the Grand Blanc, they averaged at 6.9 seconds, which is well below the 9 minutes, which is, in our eyes, phenomenal. And that there was 88% of them were below the 90% that standard that they set. So, bottom line is that I think that you're Fire department's doing a good job. So with that, questions about the study? Any questions about the process or anything that you haven't at all?
Mr. Massey?
Yes. My question is, Brighton Township is much larger than Grand Blanc Township, right?
Okay.
Its fire department employs 2 times more than the Grand Blanc Township department, right?
Correct.
Okay, if all of that is right, now my question to you, why do you think the city asked you to include Brighton Township in the study?
That's an excellent question. I do not know the answer to that. And they were insistent that it be included as one of the comparisons.
I thought when you're doing comparison, you look for a lot of similarities.
As I said, we actually came up with a list of about 14 fire departments that had, and again, we looked at the number of stations and looking for municipalities that had three stations or close to that. And we came up with about 15 of those and gave them out to the township and the fire department and to the city. And city wanted Brighton. That was not on one of the list of the 15 that we had. I really don't know why they wanted Brighton.
Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Mansour?
I have 3 questions. First,
3.
yeah,
Okay.
get them all in now. Fire allocation study, of the studies that you do, like how many of these allocation studies for fire departments alone? I suppose you do them for other departments as well. But how many would you say you do annually or have you done in the past?
Actually, cost allocation plans are, this cost allocation plan that we did,
Yeah.
were not necessarily for the fire departments. These are cost allocation plans that we do for the township and for the city. And in that is one number that is for the fire department, and it's allocating the fire department's time. So any municipality, and as I said, we do about 3,500 of these, we've got clients across the country, but any municipality that has a fire department would show up as a department, a line item in their department. And so we would always be allocating costs to a fire department if that was one of the municipalities. So every one of the cost allocation plans that we do, we're allocating to a fire department.
So many.
Yes, lots, sorry.
Okay. And I'm curious, in terms of the way you took a look at the number of housing units as one of your allocation methodologies or ways to look at it, how come that didn't include like commercial, or did it include commercial establishments?
As I recall, that did not actually include commercial. It was just housing, and I think that it was the data that was that the census provided. We thought that the housing was more of a comparative, compatible statistic than throwing in the commercial too, because of the kind of commercial properties that were in the area. So we just used housing.
Okay, you ended up throwing out that basis anyway, but it's just kind of interesting because we have a lot of commercial property, a lot of square foot under roof or commercial, so that has to be protected as well. And then the third question was about capital costs. So you have a section in here where you took our projections on how much capital it take. And so that would be, all the numbers we've seen so far do not consider that at all. From an apples-to-apples basis, the expenses you compared were operating, not capital expenses for all of these fire departments.
The chief, Chief Bennett Scott, has done a phenomenal job projecting out capital expenditures for equipment replacement. And we looked at that, and with the new, because this is a cost-based study based on the 2017 costs. It's not looking at future stuff, but we're confident that with the new millages that are in place by both the city and with the township, that the expenditures and the revenue that are coming in should be adequate to fund the capital that's going to be required.
So basically, all the numbers you have shown us are all comparable in terms of $3.8 million for Brighton and 1.5 for Grant. I mean, those are all purely operating expenses.
Yes.
And then so we would have to add the capital on top of that to get a full picture of what we spend on fire.
Correct, yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Mr. Stryker? I'd like to thank you for the in-depth study. I think one of the areas maybe you can just touch on before we wrap up is with regard to depreciation. I know there's some question in terms of that I believe station number 1, which is in the city.
Correct.
Was there any concern over how we depreciated that, or versus?
Yeah, there was a lot of concern. They didn't get any depreciation for it because the building is been fully capitalized. It's such an old building that there's not any depreciation for the station component of it. They did do an addition, which was a fairly large addition onto it, which is a community room, and they wanted that part of it depreciated. The city, when I say they, the city wanted
Right.
that part depreciated, but it's not space that's been designated to the actual fire department. It's being used as a community room, as such as it should be. So the Boy Scouts, the police department, the fire department can use it, but there hasn't been any actual space that was allocated to the fire department. It just happens that it's attached to the fire department building. So when we're looking at cost allocation plans, we've got rules that we have to follow, which are really set out in the federal regulations. And we just really felt like we could not allocate that portion of the costs to the fire department because it has not been specifically designated fire department space.
Were there any other areas of the study that were contentious in terms of the city not agreeing with?
Well, there was one that they didn't have any problem with, which was when we did the allocation for insurance, we found that the city had not actually had an expenditure for the fire department in 2017. So it didn't appear that it was covered by fire coverage. But it now is, and we were concerned that, and when we're doing the study, and it will be covered in the future. We just added it was like $1,800, so we gave them that $1,800, which is what they're paying in 2018, and we put it into the study. It should be a cost, and I just don't know. I think that they thought that the commission was covering it, and I don't think that it was. So.
And part of the study is that you look at the amount of time that we may put in on payroll, labor negotiations, things like that, right?
Absolutely, that was one of the other issues. When we allocated time for the superintendent's office and allocated time for the manager's office, we, for the township, looked at transaction count, and we allocated their time based on the number of transactions that were processed through the office. When we did the city's cost allocation plan, we did the exact same thing for them. So we wanted to treat both municipalities the same way when we were doing the cost allocation plan. We later found out that the city had detailed time records for the time that they were spending on the fire department. And so we looked at that, and we just didn't feel confident that the data was accurate enough that we could use it, because the amount of time that appeared that they were spending on the fire department was a large amount. The mayor and the city manager were spending like 50% of their time just on the fire department, and it didn't pass any test for us, and so we didn't feel confident, and we wanted to make sure that the studies were done consistently, and so we did it with transaction count. And the city had originally agreed that transaction count was fine, so we continued with that.
Chair,
Yes, Mr. Massey?
if I heard you correctly, you said the mayor spends more than 50% of her time towards the fire department?
I believe that it was 40 or 50% of her time was spent on the fire department. She spent more time on the fire department in the time study that we had than on the police department.
Were there explanations, records, what the duties were, the duties the mayor was performing?
All we received was a spreadsheet with the percentages. So we didn't get any narrative explanation, no.
Is that the only person in the city that was spending a lot of time in the fire department? Towards the fire department?
No, there were quite a few individuals that were spending a lot of time on the fire department.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, so would it be fair for me to say that they are really saying that the police, I'm sorry, that the fire chief is not doing a damn thing? Is that right? Would that be right?
I don't know the answer to that. We didn't use the data.
I'm very much concerned about data that's been thrown around very loosely. Okay? And someone is telling this board that they spend at least 50% of their time, 2 or 3 people from the city, spending at least 50% of their time towards the fire department. So that tells me that the fire chief is not doing anything, which I know that is inaccurate. That's hard for me to believe that someone would tell you that.
I imagine, Mr. Stryker, for your, the integrity of your company, and also to have your study hold up, I'm sure you've gone to court under previous situations in order for it to hold up and pass certain tests. You have to make sure the information is valid and have certain tests that you look at.
Sure.
And that's why that information wasn't necessarily included. When you mentioned that Mr. Lehman has signed off and the city signed off on what were they signing off on? Yeah, I saw it. But for the public, what is it that
they're signing
that
off
they're
to certify
saying?
that the expenditures that we've used are actual expenditures for 2017. It's a certification that we get from the financial representative, and so they are the expenditures that we actually used were 2017 expenditures. So that's what they're signing off on.
So did I hear it correctly that after they signed off, then they wanted to make a change? Or?
Correct. Yes. Yep.
Okay.
And there were the 2 situations after that both the parties had signed off on them that the city wanted to make the changes. One was on the time estimates for the mayors and the mayor and the manager's office, and the square foot issue on the fire department.
Okay. So the difference in I call it in kind, or what are we calling it, the contribution that hasn't been accounted for in the past.
The indirect costs?
The indirect costs are made up of things like how much time your staff is spending. Sure. So it would directly affect the outcome of that.
Absolutely. It would make a difference with the study, yes.
Okay. Mr. Thomas?
Mr. Stryker, so just to make this clear, the township is still doing all the administrative work for the fire department, correct? Payroll.
Absolutely. They're doing the payroll. And
Our attorney.
Yep. Yes. Yep.
We're the employer of record for the fire department.
I just wanted to clarify that, being that the mayor spends 50% of her time over there. And my other question is, how many years did we go without any fire insurance on the fire department again?
I couldn't answer that. I just know that in 2017, when we were looking at allocating the insurance expenditures for the city. And we asked where the insurance expenditure was for the fire department. That's when we discovered that the coverage wasn't there.
Okay.
Maybe she's.
And I think, you'll agree, and the study shows that our fire department with the NFPA standards is at the top. And when you compare us to other communities which are of like kind, we rate near the top. So
Yes.
I think that bodes well for our fire department in terms of operations.
It certainly appears that you've got an excellent running fire department. The commission seems to be, a good organization structure, and your chief does a good job. Yes, he has.
Okay. Well, we appreciate the work that you've done, and
Thank you.
want to thank you, Mr. Stryker.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the job. If you have any other questions, please feel free to give us a call.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I think we said before that we know that we have a great fire department, but I think the study, I didn't realize we were going to actually get some results in terms of comparison, in terms of performance of our fire department. But I think we have a number of the leaders of our fire department here, and I think I'd like to congratulate them on a fine job, and it's showing up in our study that you guys are doing an excellent job. So. Mr. Limina?
Do you have his
My
thumb
memory's
drive back so he can?
I'm keeping it. I'm kidding. Here.
If we're gonna make Mr. Kilmer stick around, let's make him.
Let me give you that here. Okay, thanks. Okay.
Thanks, Corey.
Okay, just get. Okay, our next presentation is we're going to hear an update from Rose Pest Solutions on the 2018 mosquito abatement program. Good evening.
Good evening, how we doing?
Well, we're not having to worry about any mosquitoes.
Right, I know. I'll keep it pretty short because I know it's January and I'm here to talk about mosquitoes, so won't be too bad. I like to show at the end of the season here, stop in, just kind of give a quick synopsis of how the 2018 season went in a nutshell of what was done and how the season went for us. April, we started off with a decent amount of snowmelt leading into the season. Not gonna lie, it was quite a much. Right after that, it was followed by higher than average temps within a week. We did start on April 16th, which is the start of the season. That was pretty much due to just surveillance because we were running into ice almost everywhere around the township. And then within 10 days, it was 75 degrees. So we started having isolated hatches almost right away. That kind of caught us off guard a little bit. So leading into May and June, we did have a spike in calls due to these isolated hatches. May and June with the weather, we did have average rain and average temps, but the calls kept coming in due to the isolated hatches we were having in the beginning. That pretty much kept us busy with the barrier treatments. Excuse me, just like last year, we pushed the use of the backpack fogger a lot more. Pretty much on target with the way we did last year, which seemed to do very well for us. July and August, pretty quiet. We didn't have much weather or much anything about calls or weather. Nothing really out of the ordinary there. With the weather helping us out, it let us catch back up a little bit, getting back on track with our larviciding schedule. Going into September through the end of August, it seemed to rain almost every other day. Now, it didn't rain a lot, but it did rain enough to keep the containers full. What I mean by containers, it's the pools, the kids' toys, the gutters, the bird baths, anything that holds water, which led into another slight spike in calls. But what I like about out here is the education you guys have. We've been out here for quite a while, so the education getting around the community is we don't get the nuisance calls for the containers as much as we used to. Everybody out here almost educates their neighbor. If somebody new moves in, they automatically tell them, hey, you need to be dumping that out. So the education has definitely got around, which helps us out in the long run. Certain neighborhoods, we still deal with a little bit of container issues, but not overall like we do in some of the other townships. So it's pretty good here, and I chalk that up to the education for the residents. Every call was addressed before the end of the season. Quick overview though, the weather fought us back both at the beginning and the end of the season. Now the one in the beginning kind of caught us off guard because we're not used to a hatch that early. Mid-June we were able to gain control, get back on track. The weather at the end of this season wasn't very surprising to us. We're used to the container stuff, that usually happens every year. Pretty much we were able to go through the entire season with no hiccups, no major concerns, no major issues. A couple stats for you guys. This is the part I like to give. We had 1,640 man hours in the township. We addressed 749 resident calls. 1,290 pounds of larvicide was used. 6,165 month briquettes. 36 gallons of adulticide. And a little note on the adulticide there. The truck-mounted adulticiding unit only used 9 gallons of that. The other 27 was used by the backpack. So if 9 gallons can cover 55 miles, imagine how much 27 we can do out of a backpack. So it just goes to show you how much more we utilize in that backpack. It just allows us to pinpoint a lot more stuff before it gets out to the residential population. If we can see something popping up in a swamp or a woodlot, and we can get to the back of it with the backpack and we can take care of the problem before it emerges, then we're ahead of the game already. We tested 9 pools for West Nile this year. All came back negative. But as of November 29th, there was 104 cases in Michigan and there were 8 deaths this year. So the West Nile is up this year. And that's all I got for you. Any questions?
So is that a substantial, I know last year I believe was a pretty rough year for mosquitoes, right? I mean, so probably we're up a little bit.
Yes and no. The West Nile, see, the problem with West Nile is it's only reported if you go to the hospital, and over 50% of people that contact West Nile is asymptomatic. They don't even know. Like, you can have West Nile and not even know it. Mm-hmm. And vice versa. That is no different than a peanut allergy or anything else. You can get it and you can have a complete reaction from it. So this is just going off of what's reported. There were less deaths last year, and there were less cases. Now, what that's having to do with, I don't know if that's the warming of the temperatures and bringing it up. It could be due to, just like this year with the early hatch, everybody kind of dealt with that. I mean, like I said, it went from we were cracking ice to look for larvae in the beginning of the season to less than a week later, we were already having the emergence of mosquitoes, just due to the big swing in the weather. Mm-hmm. So,
I think you guys do a fabulous job.
Thank you.
I appreciate what you do. Any questions? Okay.
Good.
We appreciate your time.
Thank you guys. Enjoy your week. Have a good weekend.
Okay. Thank you.
See you next time.
Okay, we're going to move on to future positioning, and we will, and we're going to, on that Rose pest solution, I guess one of the things we got to decide is where we're at on that, and I guess we can talk about that under future agenda, or, I mean, Mr. Lehman actually sent out an email today, or in the last couple of days to all of us, and my fear, to be honest with you, is that I really don't want to delay too much longer, because I know how permitting sometimes works at the state level, and I would hate to us miss the deadline, and now we're in the middle of mosquito season and we're just getting started. Yes, Mr. Atkins.
I'd be comfortable making the motion based off some of the findings. I think Mr. Lehman has already put enough some research into what other companies are out there that are available to do this, just to get some cost comparison. I'm confident continuing with Rose Solutions for the, I think it was the 3-year agreement that we talked about.
Second.
5.5.
Well, the yearly contract, whatever that was. Help me out with the
4-year agreement.
Yeah.
Up to a 5.5.
And the increase was 5.5% over the prior 4-year agreement, and it's locked in for the next 4 years.
So what was originally presented, I make the motion to accept that.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Guzek.
Sorry, one sec.
Okay, any further discussion?
Can we just do that on our,
No.
Can't we add it to the agenda so we can get it done tonight?
Well, it
Mr.
was
Raddick?
something that was brought up at our Mr. Mance was speaking, that we kind of have a policy, not kind of, we do, that we don't necessarily vote on things that aren't on our agenda. However, this was kind of tabled at our last board meeting for Mr. Levy to do some further research. So it isn't as though it's an entirely new topic.
In the interest of time, Chairman, Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
I'd like to call for the motion. Call for
up
the
the
vote.
vote. Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, we'll move forward on the agreement then. With that, we will move on to our future positioning, and first up, Mr. Atkins, you want to talk a bit about the Valley Stream mapping? I know we're going to look at a proposal later on, but we've got a couple of items here. One is retirement of our Parks Director and the recruiting process, the update to the joint operating agreement, but I guess this is as good a time as any to, I'll bring up the slide that has that on it. And this was in the packet.
Did you want to remove that then from operational
Well,
issues?
no,
or just-
we'll vote on it there in terms of
Okay.
making the vote, but if you want to discuss the mechanics of it, I don't know if everybody can see that or not on there.
So we
But it's in
started,
your packet as well. That
Yeah.
was sent out, and it's online as well.
so we started this project like back in September, and worked closely with Kay and had a lot of input from the board in terms of how do we see ourselves, how do we process information in projects from start to finish with Parks and Rec, and what is their input, and how many steps is involved in that compared to the township, or compared to us as well as the city, and then how do the schools and the senior center interact with them as well. So on this map, if you look here, we looked at the previous map quite a few times, but this is the new refined version, and there's about 3 or 4 steps that were taken out of this to really streamline the process on how we approve projects with Parks and Rec and kick them off. So as you can see, I could read them off, but actually I will. So the supervisor or superintendent is really the first line of person to identify a project, just like the city, senior center, and the school. In terms of project approval, the next step would be project approval, and then what that cost may be associated with that. Kind of go and see, kind of collect more data for it. Then there's board approval, commission approval, and then generate quotes, present quotes to consider for approval, and then superintendent sources project RFPs, and then those projects are funded by the township. So nothing different or unique than what we've been doing. There were a few extra steps in there that we found that maybe we could cut out and do ourselves a little more favor of getting a little more efficiency in the process.
Okay, any questions on the mapping? Ms. Lane?
Mr., through you to Trustee Atkins, on the township and the city, the council and the board give their approval. You added here that we would send it to the commission for approval. Why did you include that there in ours when it's not included in other places?
Well, we've talked about this, trustee or Clerk Lane. We've talked about this. I've taken your notes. Mr. Guzek had some comments and then some input in the last meeting. Met with Kay. I can't speak for what the city does, but I think Kay maybe can enlighten us a little bit if.
I think it has a lot to do with them maintaining it, because they use our park and it's our projects, but yet the commission's charged with maintaining it.
Exactly. That's the biggest difference, is that the city's maintaining their own parks, doing their own development, whereas we're maintaining Bicentennial Park, doing most of the development and the day-to-day operations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions for Ms. Edson? Anything else on the Valley Stream mapping?
Oh,
Yes, Mr. Massey?
Value stream map.
Yep. And then we can talk about,
Hey,
go ahead, what was your question on the next item?
yes.
Supervisor Bennett, before we leave this,
Yes.
do we need to take some kind of action maybe to adopt this value stream or?
We have that under, it's going to be the second issue under operational issues.
That's fine.
Okay. Next on the Parks and Rec was retirement of the director and the recruiting process. So we, I don't know, I guess, Mr. Atkins, you want to report on that? You're the...
Yeah.
I should back up a little bit. One of the things I did was I asked Mr. Thomas to serve on the police committee, and I asked Mr. Atkins to actually serve on the Parks Commission, and both agreed. We also have another appointment to another commission tonight too that we'll take care of here in a minute, but both of them agreed to my change, and I'd like this board to actually approve that.
Accept your recommendation? Is
Yes.
I would so move, Mr. Supervisor, that we accept Mr. Atkins moving to the Parks and Rec Commission to replace Mr. Thomas to serve on the Police Committee and the Zoning Board of Appeals that Mr.
Well,
Atkins is on. Is that what you're talking
No,
about?
Mr. Atkins is going to continue to serve on that.
Oh.
So,
Okay.
all right, so
it's
you're
just
making a
two
motion, Ms. Lane?
changes. Yes, sir. With the police, the
Okay.
appointment to the Police Committee for Mr. Thomas and Mr. Atkins exchanging in
Yes.
Parks and Rec Commission.
Support.
No problem.
Okay.
Support.
Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? With that, Mr. Atkins, would you like to report on?
Yeah, so a few things have happened in terms, so we had the commission meeting not too long ago, talked about how we would handle the recruitment for the director position. It was voted and passed on to have it posted. There were a few things that needed to be addressed in terms of job description and overall compensation package. Don't know exactly. I think most of that has been resolved now. Don't know if it was posted on the 18th. I think that's what was discussed. And the posting's going to be up for a month.
Actually, it's posted as open till filled.
Open till filled. Okay. And really, that's all to report on that. I mean,
Well, Ms. Lane?
I was chairman of the Parks and Rec Commission when Mr. Creasy retired. Are they going statewide the way we did when we selected Kay, but we interviewed several people statewide in order to get the best candidate, and I wondered if they were considering going statewide as we did and interviewing those candidates.
are you directing the question to me?
Yes, I would.
Yes.
Okay,
guess
because I think that I think I would
didn't know
defer
that-
it to the Parks Board that is here tonight. I don't know if they're going to do that or not.
Well, before we get to that
Okay.
point, one of the things that Mr. Atkins requested from Mr. Laddie was a legal opinion. And Mr. Laddie, would you be prepared to talk about that a bit?
Sure.
Okay.
I would. And I think that, and again, we discussed this a little bit at our last meeting. And we had discussed the existing Parks and Rec agreement, which we all agree is many years old. And we've had discussions specifically about the partnership between the three entities, the schools and the city and the township. And we've discussed, we've discussed the issue of who's actually an employer in this situation, because according to the agreement, there's no designation necessarily for any of the municipalities to be an employer. And I think a lot of the employment duties have been carried out by the Parks and Rec Commission over the years. And I think with the retirement of Kay's long tenure, I think the issue of employment has come up again. And again, we touched on that last week. And from a legal standpoint, I've shared these concerns with the attorney counsel for the city and also for the schools. I have a concern that the statute that we operate under, which is MCL 123.51, authorizes a city, township, or school board to operate a park system. That statute authorizes any one of those entities to employ a superintendent and whatever assistants are required. And then further on in that statute, there's a section that allows a recreation committee to be formed to really handle the administrative duties of the operation of the park system. And I think if you look at the 1970 agreement, you'll see that it really mirrors the language of the statute. But one of the things that has been an ongoing, occasional topic of discussion is exactly who do parks employees work for? Do they work for the Parks Commission? Do they work in combination for the city, the schools, and the township? And this is an issue that I think we have to address sooner rather than later, in my opinion, because we know the process of the Parks Commission essentially handling the administrative duties and personnel duties. We know that budgets are submitted to the township and the city, and I don't know, I mean, the agreement, our 1970 agreement calls for the school board to actually have a copy of the agenda or the budget and approve the budget. But we don't have any direct employer. And let me give you an example of a direct employer. When we redid the Fire Commission agreement, the statute required us to identify a direct employer. It was either going to be the city or the township, and because of our size and our HR abilities and our administrative abilities, it turned out to be the township. We also, when we look at other standalone municipal entities, and I'm thinking right now an Act 57 Fire Authority is a good example of a standalone legal entity. Actually, our DDA is another standalone legal entity. These are things that when we discuss these entities, we recognize that they're autonomous, that they have their own legal identity, they can sue, they can be sued, and they're actually, because of that, they are proper employers, proper public employers. If you think about employment, it's really based on contractual obligations, right? I mean, the employer has contractual obligations to the employees, and they have corresponding obligations to the employer. We don't have that here. And I think what has happened from a practical standpoint is there have been occasions when there has been the need for personnel input for the Parks and Recreation Commission, and that's completely understandable. And they have done as good a job as they could to try to keep up with those personnel responsibilities. Just like the township has found, though, with the addition of our superintendent, Mr. Limita, and the addition of our HR generalist, we have improved our HR administrative capabilities greatly. And I'm afraid, from a practical standpoint, that Parks and Rec is being lost in that, or they haven't been able to develop an increase in their abilities like the township has. What that means, in addition to a practical standpoint, is that if we do have a personnel issue that arises, either an obligation made to an employee or some liability situation that occurs, that first of all, the economic founders or participants in this agreement are going to be looked to satisfy any sort of obligation. So that means, according to our 1970 agreement, potentially the schools, the city, and the township could be 1/3 involuntary partners in any sort of economic recovery. That's a situation where you find yourself with liability, particularly the schools, if you think about it. You have yourself exposed to liability, but you don't have the ability or the responsibility to assist in the administration. You don't have the ability to provide expertise to the level that is in demand today. And so I'd like you guys to consider how we resolve that issue. And the way we resolved it at the fire commission level is we identified an employer of record. I think we have the ability to do that with our partnership with the schools and the city, and however that turns out, it would have to be the result of negotiations between those three. But I think we have to move this issue up to the front burner, because we're just about to engage in potentially a long-term agreement with the future director. And it seems to me that you'd want to resolve this lingering liability issue and administrative issue before you make a commitment to somebody long term. And the other thing is, look at it from the standpoint of a parks employee. Who is their employer? Who's responsible for their benefits? Right now, it's a committee or a commission that makes decisions and is funded by 2 municipalities, but it doesn't necessarily have public employer obligations like the city does, or the township does, or Parks and Rec, or the school board does. It's interesting historically, this issue's come up before regarding a parks committee, and it had to do with just a single parks committee, and it was an attorney general opinion back in the 60s. And the reason that in addition to a recreational commission, there was also a request to the attorney general to figure out whether or not there was a public employer for an interlocal supervisors agreement. This was important because back then Social Security was a distinct entity and not available to certain public employees. They had to come from a public employer retirement system. Those issues have all been solved legislatively. But I think the analysis and the result is still important. And the Attorney General said that under either one of those statutory schemes, they didn't recognize the committees as a juristic entity or as a standalone entity. That same fear that they had on those two entities back in the 60s, I still have today, and I think we're still living with. And these concerns not only are limited to Grand Blanc Township, but also should be shared by the city and the schools. So I realize this is, I've ventured off into Attorney General opinions from the 60s, but this issue has been ongoing for a while. It gets talked about from time to time. I was just looking through some of my records, and I see notes of this discussion a few years ago where we weren't sure. There was a possibility that the employees could be considered city employees or township employees. I think it's time we solve this once and for all. And stand by and try to answer whatever questions you have.
Mr. Massey?
Director K made a comment about the posting.
About the what, I'm sorry?
Posting for a new director.
Mm-hmm.
All of my years working with a few companies, and all of my years reading the newspaper section of postings, I have never seen or heard of a posting say it's posted until we fill the job. So to me, that means it could be tomorrow morning. Just want to mention that. But I have 3 questions for you. Who writes the checks for Parks and Rec employees?
Well, I think that Parks and Rec Commission authorizes the checks, and probably, I don't know who processes that.
For the employees, I think. What do you mean?
Yes.
By that? In payroll or?
Who makes the checks out? Who is responsible for making out the checks to Parks and Rec?
I don't know the answer to that, but the answer's in the room.
We do payroll, Dennis, for Parks and Rec?
All we do is process payroll for Parks and Recreation. The payroll comes from Kay, and we actually process it through our payroll system. And then as far as who signs those actual checks, I'm assuming it's somebody from the commission or whatever. I'm sure Mr. Hester or Director Edson can answer that question for you.
So they have a tax ID number for payroll?
They have
do?
their own tax ID number.
Okay, I have another question. Who writes the check or processes the check for their health insurance benefits?
Their benefits are administered through the township, but as far as, I mean, they reimburse us, as you recall our conversation from December, when Trustee Thomas authorized some additional funding to get it caught up. We administer the benefits through our Blue Cross system. They have the same benefits as the township, but the actual processing, the payment of it comes from Parks and Recreation Commission.
My final and last question. Who processed the W-2 forms and whose name is on the W-2 forms as the employer?
The employer is shown as Grand Blanc Parks and Recreation Commission.
So, based on, Superintendent, all the response that you have given to my answers, okay, we are operating illegally because based on what the attorney has said and the way I interpret it, the Parks and Rec is not a legal entity to operate under the statute that he quoted.
I think that's technically correct. I don't necessarily, I'm not gonna say that the way we're currently operating is illegal necessarily, but it's certainly far from ideal. And it exposes us and the schools in the city to liability.
Well, attorney, I'm not questioning your integrity or character, but I can say this. Based on how the superintendent has response to my question, we operating totally illegal. We have people in Parks and Rec that have been given a lot of power and they are not liable for anything. That's my interpretation of what you.
Well, that's practically absolutely true. Let's say hypothetically there was some employment obligation that Parks and Rec owed to some employee. Parks and Rec just exists through the operation of a program on an annual budget, and they exist from our approval of their budget and the city's approval of the budget. If we didn't approve the budget, or if the programs didn't operate, then I don't know what Parks and Rec would do about their obligations to their employees, because there's no legal entity there. They just operate as a commission at basically at our request.
So, Mr. Lima, do they have their own workers' comp, or they do?
They do.
But but they're not.
They have their own liability insurance. They have that through Michigan Park Plan, just like we do. They carry their own workers' comp insurance. They operate as a separate entity, and it's pretty much spelled out in the 1970 agreement as well. Is that we're going to bequeath them with these powers, and they're going to have the ability to hire people. And I think where Attorney Laddie is pointing out is that the 1965 Attorney General's opinion really shows that in a case, the concern is we set up an operation, we all agree that the Parks and Rec Commission had these authorities. And so we have an operating agreement that says we all agree that they have these powers of authority. We process their payroll for them, we process benefits for them, but really don't manage it. They manage it all themselves. All we do is process it. The difference becomes is whether or not they're considered a standalone legal entity, a standalone governmental entity. And I think that's really the question that that David's bringing up, is that there is some, at least one AG opinion to suggest that it wouldn't stand up, as a juristic entity. That even though we've all agreed, and we all agreed, the three of us got together and made this agreement, there's still a question mark associated with it, and it's probably been that way since 1970.
But, Mr. Chair, I have a great concern here. When you said we agreed, I have never agreed to a 40-year-old agreement. I have always spoke in opposition to that agreement. Now, I don't know what you mean by when you said we agree.
Because once the board's taken an action, that action exists when those actions don't get thrown out the window when a new board gets seated. So when you became part of this board, then you were part of that agreement. The board has agreed to it. Those actions continue until such a time that this entity would make a change in that agreement.
Okay. Now, what you're really saying, the old board members that have been around for at least 10 years is guilty of operating illegally. Basically, that's what it is. We're operating with the Parks and Recs illegally. Now, those are strong words.
I'm not saying that. Let's go on the record as you said what you're saying, and I want to make sure that we're saying it. I'm not saying that. We're not operating illegally.
I think Mr. Laddie has written an opinion, and I think all of us are interpreting that. And I hear what you're saying, Mr. Massey, and it's an uncomfortable position for this board to be in, because we have our legal advice telling us one thing and we're operating in a different manner. Now, you're right, the gears are not meshing on what our attorney says needs to be happening and what actually is really happening. And whether we want to call that illegal or not, we know where we stand.
Let me put it this way, I don't want to find out if it's legal or not. There's proper insurance, there's proper administration as far as employee identification number. There's an issue, I think, regarding health insurance. I don't know how a non-employee participates on a health insurance plan for an employer, but these are things that have all. There's no issue that has come up in the past, and there's no I that hasn't been dotted or T that hasn't been crossed by the commission. I'm not faulting the commission, and I'm not necessarily faulting prior board members or the city or the schools. I'm saying that this is a lingering potential problem, and we and the Parks and Rec Commission have talked about amending that very old agreement. And it seems like a good time to amend that very old agreement, even though I think Parks and Rec already took a shot at it, would be before you enter into some long-term employment agreement with the new director.
Mr. Atkins?
Well, because I hear, the board has agreed to this and this type of language, I don't have the agreement in front of me, but I guess I would ask either Mr. Limita or Mr. Laddie, probably Mr. Laddie, would you say that we're following the agreement 100%?
I would say that we're following the agreement as it was written. I would say that the fundamentals of the agreement, with the exception of there have been, and again, there's nothing in the agreement that identifies any sort of funding mechanism other than approval of the budgets by the three entities. I think that Parks and Rec and the city and the township have engaged in some different sort of funding mechanism, because the programs have grown, the uses have shifted, and I think the practical effect of that has been to move around the financial obligations. I think the agreement should be, if it's amended, should be amended to show the different financial responsibilities. Because somebody said 80-20, somebody proposed 80-20 or something like that, with a large part of the budget being generated by the parks programs themselves. So there are other things that we need to change in addition to just this employer of record issue.
Mr. Mansworth and Mr. Thomas.
So, I don't recall off the top of my head reading it, but as I read the parchment agreement, that there were some items on there that were simply no longer being followed simply because over the 40 years names of commissions and other mechanisms have changed. So I can do some quick research, but I would not agree that we are in 100% compliance with that agreement. And when you talk about some of the other topics that were mentioned here, whose name's on a W-2, whose name's on a pay stub, who we're getting insurance from, I think that kind of an objective third party might look across that and be confused about who the employer of record is, may have some assumptions, which I think creates enough of a question that it really lends to where the liability would hit in a number of areas in employment, if there were to be an employment issue. So, if we don't have that clearly in front of us, we have an agreement that I think most on the board, I wouldn't speak for everyone, agree that needs to be updated. I mean, I feel as though, we're exposing our township residents to some kind of an unknown liability. And as we look ahead at the board, the Parks Commission potentially making some significant moves in terms of personnel or other decisions, I mean, I would have to ask, what kind of legal options do we have in order to put the brakes on this until we can kind of come to a place where we can agree on, those elements that Mr. Laddie brought up earlier to make it clear who's employer of record and all these issues.
The other point, I attended the Parks Commission meeting last week with Mr. Atkins and Mr. Limita, and also under consideration are the employment agreements for 7 employees. Or employment contracts are under consideration, which, I don't know if you've seen those, Mr. Atkins?
No, I haven't.
So it isn't just the Parks Director that we're committing to with this hire. It's, there's other contracts that on an ongoing basis that are being considered as well. So, Mr. Mansouri, you have some questions. We'll let Mr. Laddie respond, but Mr. Thomas?
Well, I totally concur with Trustee Mansour that we are not following the original agreement. There's a lot of, I prefer to call them handshake deals, and there's never been an amendment to that. Well, for example, the director's retirement is supposed to be paid through the schools. I know that's not going on. I know that we're not ever supposed to pay rent for the Parks and Rec Commission building. That's in the agreement. We are. No, we're not following that agreement. In the whole idea we are, but I've sent this to each and every one of you, I don't know, every 3 months, the obligation. And I'm just curious to hear what Attorney Laddie has for an answer for Trustee Mansour.
Well, what are our options? I think that, and again, this is something that we talked about last month, which was the Parks and Rec Commission has proposed some changes to the existing agreement. I don't know if the township, we have not proposed any changes to the agreement. I don't think the city has either. I've made contact with Attorney Collins for the schools and Attorney Griffin for the city and shared with them my concerns and our concerns. And they don't seem to be similarly worried. And so at this point, it's interesting because I know that timing of important events have been set in motion. I know that there's a desire to carry on with directorship for the parks. I also don't believe that these major issues would be that hard to reformulate in a modern agreement that more reflects the operation between the entities. So I think our options, and again, there's an option for us to not participate in the future, which really, if you want to think about what is the problem with operating the way we are, if one of the three decided to withdraw from the agreement, that would be your answer right there. What would happen next? How would this be funded? How would any of this work? And so, without exercising that possibility, I think that we need to make a formal request to the city and the schools to say we want to amend this agreement, modernize this agreement, and make sure that we've covered all the liability issues that we believe that we have. And we want to do it right away, like as soon as possible.
Mr. Atkins and Mr. Thomas?
I guess when I keep hearing the term agreement, it's a little sensitive to me, so I'd ask Mr. Laddie, can you still call something an agreement if you're selectively following it?
It's not a good agreement if you're selectively picking and choosing what parts of it you're following. It's not, and if it's not reflective of your current operation, then it's not a good agreement.
Or it's not an agreement? No, it's still there until you change it, right?
Well, that resolution, and the reason, and listen, I'm not trying to sound vague, but that agreement, I mean, it's entitled an agreement, is meant to allocate administrative responsibility. It doesn't necessarily allocate financial responsibility, but we know that over time that's what's happened. We know that the allocation of personnel responsibilities has been well undertaken by the commission, but still we know that there's a disconnect between the personnel expertise of its founding members and the commission itself, because the commission doesn't have the wherewithal, the budgetary wherewithal, to be as good at HR as we are, or the city is, or the schools are. And so because it allocates different responsibilities, it isn't a matter of saying, thumbs up or thumbs down. But obviously we know it's old. We joke that it's on parchment paper, but it's really fallen. Its purpose has morphed into something other than what was intended.
Mr. Thomas.
Supervisor Bennett, in terms, at our last board meeting, we asked Attorney Laddie to write a letter and to make contact with the two other attorneys, and that was 45 days ago?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe not quite that long, but I did that.
And you still have not received any correspondence?
No, I got a response from an associate accountant's firm saying we'd like to sit down and discuss the matter, and I didn't get anything from.
And then Supervisor Bennett, last week you attended the commission meeting with the sole purpose of trying to slow this down, and could you please expound, John?
Yeah, I attended the Parks Commission meeting with Mr. Laddie and with Mr. Limit, I'm sorry, and expressed some of our concerns with regard to the liability, and also met with Mr. Hester actually last week as well, Mr. Limit and I, and expressed some of our concerns with the liability. I guess, there's two levels to this discussion, and one is, hey, we got to hurry up and hire somebody. So, well, we want to make sure that's legal. The other is kind of the overarching organization is looking at the liability with that. And I think that was our concern with the school and the city is talking about that. At the commission meeting, that really the commission isn't necessarily looking at from our vantage point in terms of what our concerns are. They're looking at, hey, okay, the liability with hiring somebody, okay, we'll lengthen the search by a week. And I think one of the things that was offered was that the HR individuals from the city, from the township, and from the schools would be involved in having a meeting to talk about the job description and some of that. That meeting took place last week with the HR professionals. I think Mr. Limita was there as well, Miss Hudson, and I think I'm not sure our HR person gave quite a few recommendations. I'm not sure. I think a couple of them might have been adopted, and the rest I'm not sure where they're going. But the bottom line is, I think there's two levels of concern that we, I think this board's concerned with the overarching concern that the hiring is kind of secondary right now to kind of where we sit with our liability. One curious question is if I'm not, with them actually having a tax ID, what have you, if somebody wanted to collect unemployment, does that also go to the Parks Commission, or does that come back to us?
I think that all the employment responsibilities are falling to the Parks Commission. I think, again, they have an employer identification number, they have workers' comp. I mean, all our bases are covered from an operational standpoint. But
this is really strange, though, because the Fire Commission, I mean, for example, fire chief, I mean, anybody that gets hired through there, we're directly involved. If there's a work comp issue, it's going to come back at us, or not the work comp, but the unemployment. I mean, it's kind of an odd situation to be in here.
It is. And it's work.
How's that legal? How's that legal when, I'm sorry,
Mr. Thomas?
How's that legal, Attorney Laddie, when they're not our employees, but yet we're insuring them? How does that not make us liable? I mean, I don't own this company. I was elected to run this company, to help run this company, excuse me. The commission's appointed by us, the schools, one at large, and the city. How can we face our constituents saying this? That we know that something's wrong. We've talked about it for 2.5 years that something's wrong. Now it's been brought to our attention, we're being held hostage.
I did have a conversation with Mr. Garner, the superintendent of schools, this past week after the Parks Commission meeting. And we talked for a little bit of time about some of our concerns with regard to that overarching organization. Mr. Limata, myself, Mayor Soderstrom, and the city administrator, Wendy, as well as Mr. Garner, met approximately 2 weeks ago, Mr. Limata, and kind of had a discussion on a few of these issues, and they said that I asked them if we couldn't slow this thing down a little bit so that we could take a look at and assess where we're at. I even said, you know, I couldn't speak on behalf of the board, and I brought the same up to Mr. Hester and to the Parks Commission that, hey, you know, we understand that there may be some additional expense in slowing this thing down. You know, and that we would urge that if Miss Edson, I mean, we knew that she was going to be retiring this year, at least at the end of the year we had heard that. I guess none of us really realized how quickly it was going to come upon us. And so, you know, in an effort to give us some time, I urge them to take a look at having an interim director for a period of time that would allow us some time to get with the city and the school and say, hey, we've got to do something about who's going to be the employer of record, who's going to, you know, be willing to bear the brunt of any liability with regard to those issues. And, you know, I really haven't heard a response to that. So I guess, I don't know if our letter wasn't, you know, I'm not judging by your letter, but apparently, I don't know if we need to make it stronger or what, but I really am concerned with us continuing to move forward with us voicing these concerns. Mr. Massey?
Yes, I have a question. Who owns the property?
Well, the city owns their property of their parks, and we own ours. Or are you talking about equipment property?
No, I'm talking about the land.
The land, the township owns Bicentennial, and the city owns their 2 parks.
So, I'm not an attorney, so we're hit and miss on this. Help me out. It has always been my experience dealing in legal things. The person that owns the property or vehicle has more liability invested than anyone else.
Well, we certainly have premises liability at Creasy Park.
Yeah.
There's no, I mean, we own it, and we have an obligation to make sure that it's operated correctly, and that if people get hurt and we're responsible for it, it's gonna come to us as the owner of the property. You're exactly right.
So you're saying, as a street lawyer, I'm right this time?
Yes, you are.
So can't we,
So, Mr. Guzak?
yeah, so can't we just fix it so we can make somebody the legal owner of it and be done with it?
Well,
I mean, we can't keep pushing it down the road again.
To have to have the employer responsibilities.
Right, so
I
we
don't
have to
think it's
take that
hard to
step.
do that.
So
Yeah.
Well,
that's the
it's-
first step we have to take,
I
right?
think the problem we're having is convincing the city and the schools that it's a necessary thing to do, at least before we move any further forward.
Well, then at least they can say, no, we don't agree,
Right.
or we don't
How
have a
could,
problem.
how
I
could
mean,
we word, how would you suggest, Mr. Laddie, we correspond with them or let them know that this is something that's jeopardizing our agreement?
Well, I'm happy to correspond with the legal counsel, but they don't owe me an answer. As we've seen from Mr. Griffin, he doesn't seem to feel like he needs to respond to this. So I would like to do 2 things. I'm happy to correspond with them directly, but I also like our board to specifically inquire as to our partners in this entity, whether or not they share this concern, or whether or not they want to engage in an amendment to the 1970 agreement, and at least get a yay or nay.
Yeah, we gotta get it done.
Explain what you mean by that, Mr. Laddie.
Well, I think you could pass, you could pass a resolution requesting that the city and the school board formally respond to the township's request to amend the 1970 agreement.
Before any further action is taken
Yeah.
on hiring or signing any contracts.
Yeah. They're not bound by it necessarily, but the thing is, if this isn't something that we can, as a 1/3 partner in this, if this isn't something that we can at least discuss and resolve to our satisfaction, then the choices become dire for everybody.
Ms. Lane and then Mr. Massey.
Mr. Chairman, my thoughts would be that a more direct way to do it based on the limited time, we are the employer of record for the fire department. Therefore, wouldn't it be more advantageous, Mr. Laddie, to send a letter that says we are planning on becoming the employer of record for the Parks and Rec Commission?
How do we do that?
And, well, we make the proposal and if they don't respond yea or nay, then we
Well,
become.
I'll let Mr. Laddie respond to that
Yeah,
suggestion.
we have to deal with the 1970 agreement. We can't just unilaterally. Now, listen, you may say, well, we have veered away from that agreement in the past, so why can't we veer away from it again? But I think on an issue this important, I think we have to actively engage them in a discussion about it, and we have to negotiate the change. It could be they may have a different idea, they may have a different proposal.
Mr. Guzak and then Mr. Massey, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's been pointed out that we own the land and we're the one that's gonna be primary responsible for it. So it seems to me that we're gonna have to take possession of this, because if we're liable for it, we at least should have control over it, right? Because we're gonna get sued, and that's why the city and the school isn't, because they're saying, well, that's not our land, we had nothing to do with it. And the judge says, well, who owns the land, like it's been brought up, and we're gonna be stuck with all the liability.
I'm not, listen, you guys make policy, right? But I mean, if you have an entity that's highly capable from a human resources standpoint and has a lion's share of the economic obligation, it certainly seems like a logical choice would be to have the township be the employer of
Right.
record. But that doesn't necessarily make it so.
Well, I know,
And we can
I
have
know,
a discussion about it,
But we're the ones that are gonna have to pay the price, so we better step up and get it fixed.
Mr. Massey?
Yes,
My thought right now, not to create more pain on anyone than has already been created, okay? The director cannot retire and the director cannot hire anyone. And let me tell you why. The more messy that this situation becomes, if someone gives up his or her job and come on board at the direction of the director, he or she in the final agreement may be let go.
Well, if nothing else, this may cause the director to want to leave sooner. But no, all joking aside, Mr. Massey, you bring up some very valid point in that, who's going to want to take this position with the mess that and I say mess, it's not a mess with the parks. I mean, the operation of the park is fine. It's kind of the underpinnings of how this thing is set up and our board deals with policy. Operations are Mr. Limata, and we're not saying the operations are, we're saying that how this thing is organized and who holds liability cards is kind of like we've got a deck of cards and we're not sure whose are whose, which cards belong to who. And what we're asking to do is we need to sort that out before we start playing cards. And I think, we suggested that one of the things is to continue with an interim person. I mean, that could be done if the city and the schools say that, hey, this is, we agree with your liability assessment here, and they know that we're serious. So, Mr. Laddie?
Well, we're all, listen, and again, it has operated very well for a long time, and these issues have lingered for a long time. But it seems like, as you point out, it seems like a good time to resolve these issues. Understanding that we're going to honor our obligations, that people who have plans to retire are going to be able to retire. Their whatever responsibilities we have to them will be met through the three entities. But this transition time is a good time to do this. And by the way, again, I think the Parks Commission took a stab at trying to propose some amendments to that agreement before our long tenured director decided to retire. So it seems like a good time to do it, and an important time to do it.
Yes, Scott.
Mr. Mansour's had his hand up down here.
So, this board somehow, rightly or wrongly, is kind of turned into the fixing the lingering problem board. Things like fire funding and getting OPEB under control, etc. So this turns out to fit inside our wheelhouse quite well. But I didn't really hear a direct answer to my earlier question about what legal options we have. But I think that, before, we need to go on record tonight as saying we need to put the brakes on this. And so whether the other partners or the commission, accepts that direction from this board is another matter. But I think that it's incumbent on us, based on the discussion we've had tonight, to minimum go on record and say, let's put the brakes on this.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Thomas?
Two questions. Well, first to you, Mr. Chair. When you asked to put it on brakes, they said they won't hire anyone for
You mean at the Parks Commission meeting?
Yeah, for the directorship. And the 6 other employees' contracts.
Right. Well, I didn't know about the 6 or 7 other employees until after the meeting started, so I really didn't comment on that. But I'm not sure what the timeline is, what they finally came up with. But basically, I think extending the search period was basically, and my concern isn't necessarily with that, although
Okay,
I think we should have some say on it.
Through you to, I've got a question for
Sure.
Attorney Lanning,
Okay.
but through you to Trustee Atkins. What was the timeline to hire to approve the 6 contracts and the new director?
I don't have it in front of me. For the contracts, I don't know. For the director spot, it was to post it and leave it up for 4 weeks.
4 weeks. So
And then there was another timeline by time you do the background check and a couple other things. And I think the placement would be like April 1st. So
I have one more question now.
Sure.
Attorney Laddie, that gives us 3 weeks for the timeline. Would it be proper to have you form a letter to the attorneys and go on record also and send this to the mayor and the superintendent of schools, saying that if we don't formally come to an agreement, that we start working on an obligation, a new agreement, that and hire an interim director while Director Edson is retired, that we will have to go with the 1970 agreement and discharge us from the commission, and that'll be our 1-year notice.
Well, this kind of goes back to what Mr. Mansour is asking. What actions do you recommend, Mr. Laddie?
That's ultimately, when I said the choices are dire, if we ultimately don't get a response, that's what I'm talking about. You have the ability, you can withdraw from the Parks and Recreation Commission if you want.
Mr. Massey?
Let me ask the attorney a question. To put the brakes on this, can you file an injunction?
I think the answer to that's probably no,
Why?
because we have the ability to withdraw from the commission if we want. We could. So I think the answer is no. I don't think I can file like a declaratory action regarding an ongoing agreement that we have the ability to voluntarily leave.
Well, now let me say this. Based on the township owning the property, if we withdraw, that means that it's the whole thing is done,
Right.
right?
Well, it's got to be reconfigured, for sure.
Okay.
But yeah, that is, by the way, that's the last option. If you're not getting any response or you're not getting any cooperation, then you consider withdrawing.
Right. Mr. Atkins?
I mean, I think we can go back and forth on a lot of it, but I think everything goes back to the willingness of the other two participants to recognize our concerns and enter into another agreement or whatever that looks like. So I'd like to suggest a resolution to kind of let the other two parties know that we're serious and they should pick up a phone or
How would you
or
like to
send
word
an
that?
email. I'd ask Mr. Laddie a little bit of help on the wording on that.
Well, and again, the reason I say resolutions is because we're talking directly to two other legal entities, and what we want to do is convey that in a formal way. And I think by resolution, we want to. How about if we say, we believe, or as a 1/3 participant in this commission, we are of the opinion that the existing agreement is in need of immediate amendment. And we would propose to them that this amendment process begin immediately and that they respond to our request, our resolution, within 7 days to acknowledge that they'll participate in the amendment of that 1970 agreement. And if they don't want to participate, or if they don't respond to us, then we'll explore the remedies available to us in that agreement.
Well, I want to interject in that that Mr. Garner has expressed that he believes it does need amending. Okay, I think there is concern that he has that he would like to see us update it. That for every 40 years is quite a stretch to go to review an agreement. So he is in agreement that we need to do that. The problem is I'm not sure everybody realizes that the train's still rolling, and maybe we need to slow it down until this agreement. Well, I know we need to slow it down until this agreement's hammered out.
Excuse me,
Mr. Mansour.
Supervisor Bennett. I would appreciate that proposal for resolution language, and I agree with everything that's said so far. But I would like to have something inserted to indicate that we want any significant hiring or other, I guess, significant actions being considered by the Parks and Rec to be put on hold until this agreement is finalized, or whatever the.
Okay, Ms. Lane.
I would ask through you to whomever, when we went for the second and the current director, Parks and Rec Commission didn't just post it, we went out and advertised in statewide appropriate magazines for, and I'm wondering if that's what's going to happen with this current commission.
Well, let's stay on the topic that we're on right now. Mr. Laddie?
How about resolution to engage in the process of amendment of the existing 1970s agreement
77.
with response from both entities within 10 days of the resolution, and further, that any contemplated employment contracts be held in abeyance until we're able to accomplish an amended agreement.
Sounds good. Mr. Massey?
I think one thing was left out.
What's that?
He said employment contracts. And I'm thinking about action. Any action should be.
Well, any action would prohibit them probably from operating.
Well, the status quo is fine with us, right? We just don't want new contracts or new obligations entered into. We want them to
Did
stay
you say
static.
new obligation?
Well,
I
if I didn't, that's what
Okay,
that's
I
what
didn't
I
hear
wanna make clear. I don't
new
want them to engage in new contractual obligations.
Okay.
Whether it be, I guess, capital
Yep.
or whether it be employment,
Okay.
until we can
And we've done something
Resolving.
similar actually with our fire, in that we ask for no capital purchases until we come to some sort of agreement for our fire as well. So Mr. Laddie has suggested some language, and I don't know if there's a motion.
So moved, Mr. Chair.
Second.
Okay, there's a motion and second. Discussion.
Is there
Mr. Thomas?
at the end of the resolution, Attorney Laddie, through you to Attorney Laddie,
Yes.
is there a, at the end of it, did you say, or we will seek other, breaking the agreement?
Well,
He didn't say that.
I didn't say that, but I think that resolution and correspondence from me will convey that we're going to explore whatever options are available to us as a partner. And I wouldn't necessarily put that in a resolution, because again, this is an invitation. And so I'm happy to have that point made in a different correspondence.
Okay, so there's a motion. It's been it's a resolution, correct?
No, it's a motion.
Correct.
It's a resolution. So, any further discussion? Ms. Lane?
Mr. Massey,
Yes.
Mr. Mansour,
Yes.
Mr. Atkins,
Yes.
Mr. Thomas,
Yes.
Mr. Guzak,
Yes.
myself, yes, Mr. Supervisor.
Yes. Okay. So we'll get some word on that in the next 7 days, hopefully, and
Yes, sir.
we'll go from there. I think the next item that we're going to go to is our fire department. And wait a second here. Yeah.
Which item is it?
Item B, future positioning. And the board will consider future fire department operational structure based on the MGT Consulting Group financial operation study results. And I think that, again, the study showed that our fire department is operating very well, that we are at the top of the chart in terms of response time. The dollar value of service that we're offering to our residents is at the top, and I'm very pleased. And as a board, obviously, we're looking out for the most value for our residents and the best service. And from the study, it proves that we have that going on. In terms of the rest of the study, it also shows that we, in essence, have been subsidizing the city with regard to fire to the tune of close to $120,000, at least for this past year. And I would assume there hasn't been a great deal of change over the last 9 years, so it could have been that kind of subsidy annually that we were looking at. This whole study started with a concern that the city thought they were paying too much. And I just want to remind everybody, we started this process about 3 years ago, and Mr. Limita had sent communication to the city asking that we meet as a joint board to discuss fire, and we're told that they didn't want to meet. At least that went on for about a year, and then our boards did meet and started having the discussion. But it took us a little over 2 years to get to the point where we actually agreed. Well, actually, I'm not saying that we agreed, that we said that we were moving forward with a millage because we knew that we were underfunded in terms of capital expenditures, being able to afford those. And so anyways, it took us 2 years to get to the point where we actually could pass a millage, which the city fought us tooth and nail on, and actually went on TV and wrote editorials against our millage, which to me is very offensive for one municipality to take up sides against another. But we prevailed and our millage passed, and then afterwards the city decided to pass its millage. So what we have before us tonight is Mr. Laddie and Mr. Limita and myself have put together a list of pros and cons to 4 different ways of handling the agreement for fire. We know what the first one was. I don't have in front of me right the second, but that was our process as it exists today. And basically with the fire commission and the two boards operating the joint fire department. I think, you know, the fire commission has done an excellent job. Our fire fighters, our leadership has done an excellent job, and no complaints there whatsoever. It's been the governance, I think, that's strung us up for 2 years in trying to figure out how we're going to fund the fire department. And I'm pleased that we've come to this point in terms of we had a professional study conducted to ascertain what the costs are. Up until now, we've been structuring everything on how much money we could collect. And we've talked at previous board meetings that we don't operate any other department based on that. The clerk's office, the treasurer's office, we don't fund them based on how much money we can collect. It's based on what is the cost of operating those departments. And so with this study, we've looked at what is the cost of operating the fire department instead of how much money can we collect. And as all of us know, SEV is not the sole method we should be using, and that's what we've been using in the past. And so I'm glad that we've come to this point. I think we've done our residents a great service by having this study done. And I'd like to thank Mr. Limita for you know, leading us through that process, providing the information. I think it also probably provided some other valuable information to our township in terms of other departments and cost allocation. And I think this company came very highly recommended, so I'd have a tough time questioning any of the results of what they put together. But I think we've arrived at a point now where we have data that has been audited, and we have a decision to look at. And I just ask Mr. Laddie, maybe you can go through some of the pros and cons with Mr. Limita of, I guess, you know, the four that we considered were joint operation, which we currently have.
Right.
We had selling the city services, or the third one was intergovernmental agreement, and the fourth is
Act 57 authority. But
Act 57 authority, which we aren't going to go there.
Right.
So really, we just have two that we would, or three that we would consider that, and we already know what we currently have and what the pros and cons of that are. So with that, Mr. Laddie or Mr. Limita, would you like to comment on the pros and cons that we discussed?
You want to go, or you want me to go? Either way.
Now. Let's go.
So you guys all got some of this from us, and realistically, Supervisor Bennett is correct. You know, we know how we're operating now under the joint operating agreement. We know the pros and cons there. So we didn't feel it was necessary to put those out into a written format. The interlocal agreement, you know, some of the pros, obviously, we keep that continued partnership. There's no need to start to determine what the payout would be. We don't have to put a value of all the personal property and then figure out based on a split of who paid what that is. And you know that most likely would be a protracted legal battle potentially, so it would avoid that. The fire commission would remain intact and still work through the interlocal agreement. Again, you could make that interlocal agreement as detailed as possible, so you try to make sure that it's really highlighted. It's really about making it granular, getting it down to the details that really have any concerns that the board members may have, you could address within the language of an interlocal agreement. You know, obviously the cons to that would be continued partnership conflicts. I mean, we talked about what the study highlighted is that we are incredibly efficient and we're incredibly effective. We're well within the NFPA standards. The Fire Commission has done a phenomenal job. Our firefighters are the best of the best. Where our disagreements have come is arguing for 3 years on what funding level should be when we knew we were facing a funding shortfall. 3 years ago, I said it was, you know, at least $400,000. Now we look at it to be somewhere around $548,000 or $558,000. The numbers have gone up precipitously because we waited 3 years to get through this. So would that go away when we formed this interlocal agreement? Probably not. We're still going to have the same conflicts that we have about service levels, about funding, about those kind of things. One of the things that the city has continued to say is that we have to utilize fire station number 1 and it can never be closed. I'm sure that's one of the caveats that they would put in any agreement that we had. I would agree that right now fire station number 1 makes the most sense for how we're operating, but I would be loath to put in an agreement that that's always going to be the number 1 place to have a fire station operated on. I think our agreement should be something that says we're always going to operate one that makes the absolute most sense to provide fire prevention and protection services to all residents of the community. So you can see that there will be some serious negotiations, some difficult negotiations. It still keeps the commission, council, board format, and I think therein could lie an issue. So, there's some good things about keeping it intact, and we know the things that we're doing right would remain in place, but it does keeps the conflicts in place, and I think that might be one of the challenges. If we went to where we provide services, again...
So just let me make sure, Mr. Lehman, I just want to, so we're talking about intergovernmental agreement there.
Yep.
And, part of the challenge we have as a board is, we have a couple of board members here who this is their full-time place, and the problem is the rest of us are working other things, and we've got a lot on our plate that we want to accomplish over the next couple of years. We've spent, we haven't done a time allocation study for our board, but I would venture to guess that fire has been monopolizing a lot of our meetings. And, the points that we brought up with the joint agreement, or intergovernmental agreement really don't go away with that intergovernmental agreement. There's still contentious issues, and we're looking at spending more time negotiating, what have you. So I just wanted to bring that point up.
Sure. And the other thing, we had it as township provides service, but remember, by saying that, what we're really saying is our focus is going to be on providing the best fire prevention protection service that we can to township residents. And we're also still willing to provide services at cost, or, we'll sell services at cost to the city as well, rather than they form their own department. But that would really be up to them. What we're saying here is that we're going our own separate ways. We're going to dissolve the agreement, and we're going to make sure that we have the best dang fire department that we can put together for our township residents, because that's really who we're beholden to. But yet, at the same time, we also recognize the challenges of the city creating their very own fire department up, and especially, they've been paying $212,000 a year for fire. Their costs are going to go up considerably. It would put a hardship, but again, our focus is on township services. If we decide that we can sell them services, what we're really saying is we're going to take care of the township, but we will absolutely take care of the whole community just like we've done. We're going to eliminate the need for the commission. We're going to eliminate the need for negotiation. We're going to eliminate the veto power. We're going to sell you services at cost. And if we did that, obviously from an administrative standpoint and the amount of time we spent, like Supervisor Bennett just brought up, would be greatly diminished.
Mr. Lehman, one point though that you brought up was with regard to the cost of providing fire. That we wouldn't. We can't afford to continue to subsidize it even under this scenario. Their cost is going to go up regardless, right?
That was the whole point of doing the study, is to really set those costs straight so that we're no longer subsidizing. What we've shown, we felt that we were subsidizing them, but we didn't know the number. Now we know the number. Now we have a fact base that we can hold it up and say, this is it.
So, that isn't, we aren't going to be able to say, hey, we can take it on and charge anything less than what the study showed, right?
No, it would be at true cost. You have to look at, we know the cost now, and that's a beautiful thing, is uncovering the indirect costs are tough. That's why you got to hire a consultant like MGT or somebody else that can actually come in and really do it. To show you what those indirect costs are so that it gets allocated appropriately. Now we know what they are. We have a new baseline, basically, and once we know the baseline, that's everything. And selling services at cost, again, we know the baseline now, we know what it's going to be. You'd have to factor in some kind of an agreement that we're going to relook at it every 3 years, because, again, our growth potential is so much more than the city's. We look at that funding mechanism at 8614 or whatever, 8416. As we continue to grow, that would change. Maybe we look at it every 3 years, or we look at it every 5 years, and we have another cost allocation study done. and we continue to grow, they don't, and it becomes 90-10, and we're funding 90% of it. Our focus is, what is the true cost? They have to pay the cost of delivering fire. And when you do, two municipalities that agree to do this, you can't overcharge. I mean, it could be challenged in court. I mean, governments have to work it out. When we're doing something like this, we can't overcharge them for services. We can't say, well, we'd be happy to sell you services, but we're going to charge you $750,000. Right now, we're saying, based on the 2019 budget approved or sent by the Fire Commission, that their cost would probably be somewhere around $345,000 when you factor everything in. If we're just going to do the capital pay-as-you-go and we're going to fire this thing up, we're going to move forward. So their costs are going up to $345,000 a year. Those are documented, provable. I mean, we can go to court. We'll have consultants go to court that will say absolutely that's how much it costs based on this model, based on the budget before us to operate fire, and that's how much the cost would be for the city.
Mr. Lehman, would there be any change in service for the residents of either the township or the city under that scenario, you think?
Well, I think we would, our goal obviously is not to change service. We just proven that we're very effective and efficient and cost effective, and we're delivering excellent service well within NFPA standards. I don't think we want to diminish that, and I would assume that the city, if you were to do that and we became Grand Blanc Township Fire Department, but we tell the city we'd really like to continue to provide services for the entire thing, the devil's in the details. That's where you have to negotiate. You know, do you want to keep it at fire station number 1 for now and work some agreement out there? The level of service, what it would do is it would put them in a position that if we were delivering the service as we said we would in the agreement, that they could then lobby a claim against us. Hey, you guys are you're ignoring the city, or you're not giving us the service level that we used to have. Clearly, I can tell you that there's not a firefighter that works for Grand Blanc Fire Commission right now that would drop the level of service that they're trying to provide. These guys are professionals. This is what they do. Whether they don't know where the boundary is when they're making that run, they're going there to save lives or to respond to an emergency situation. So I don't believe that even for an instant that would ever be a consideration.
So residents really wouldn't see any change in service. It's more the governance issue part of it that changes.
Yeah, and it's the things. I mean, when we became the employer of record, so we handle personnel issues, and I think that's good. But it's little things like even the conversation that we had with the chief's contract just recently. We had a conversation. It's like, okay, the fire commission agrees and the township board agrees. Now we have to wait till February 13th to see how the city council feels about it. Some of those are still, that's an issue, where I think this gets addressed when if we took over services.
Well, and I don't know, somebody gave me a newspaper article from a number of years ago where even before I think this agreement was in place that, there was issues with the governance that, disagreements on matters, what have you. I mean, we had the kitchen issue. I mean, there's been a number of issues that we had to work through, but
So some of the cons that you have to think about if we were to do this is that, I mentioned it earlier, but you're going to have to go through the personal property. You're going to have to put a value on trucks, equipment, everything. You're going to have to determine that funding level of when those were purchased. And again, that's going to be litigated. And again, that's David's.
Does depreciation come into as a factor on equipment, Mr. Laddie?
What'll have to happen is there'll have to be an accounting for the present value of the equipment, and then we're going to have to go back and try to reconstruct who contributed what and figure out just exactly what amount of equity is in each piece of equipment, and then the shares will have to be accounted for.
So it may be the percentage that was contributed over the course of time.
That has to come into play. And by the way, I mean, I don't necessarily think that would be too difficult to process to kind of to review the amount of money put in proportionately into the purchase of those things, and then have the reduction in their value to the present day value just follow a formula. It's a tough process to go through, and it's cumbersome, but we can arrive at a fair value.
We hire an appraiser that is a professional in this, that goes through the equipment, and probably in a 2-week period he has a number as far as here's the value. And I mean, it's most of the equipment I'd imagine is pretty well depreciated. I don't know, we're needing, I think, multiple trucks over the next several years, so I can't believe there's a whole lot of value left. So on $500,000, let's say you got $1 million truck, which I don't know that we have one of that value, but You know, if the depreciation has brought it down to $100,000 in residual value, now, you know, it's determined that city put in, you know, 16% and we put in the remainder, then maybe that's the split on that remaining $100,000 in value. Something like that would be the order of things. Yeah.
There's two other things that you guys should consider as well. Number one of the cons would be that the fire commission, the dissolution of the fire commission, because these guys have been very effective. I think that the fire commission works in our current model, but if we're going to become Grand Blanc Township Fire Department, do you need a fire commission? You know, or would their role change? If you want to keep a commission, would their role change? Would they meet quarterly and assist you with making sure that that gave the venue to city if you were selling them services, that they had a venue to go to that was a go-between? I mean, I don't know what that would look like, but it's one of the things that you have to consider. The other thing would be when it comes to liability. Right now we have shared liability because we're a joint entity. While we take on all the liability currently for personnel issues as the employer of record, but just general property liability, it will go from shared to 100% ours.
So I know, for example, the work comp for fire, there's a special program just for firefighters with regard to, you know, the property liability in terms of the actual fire stations. You know, I believe we take care of our own and they take care of theirs, but what you're talking about in terms of liability is when they're out fighting a fire, or what liability is
fire,
driving to the fire?
I mean, everything, that liability is shared, that would suddenly become 100% township.
But it's only shared, what, 16% or whatever their contribution is,
14
right?
currently, so.
Right, so I mean, we're already taking the lion's share of that liability, right?
Correct.
It isn't like a 50-50 share on liability.
No, we have accounted for.
Okay, and I thought we would have. Okay, Mr. Atkins?
I just wanted to add, I think somebody does need to take over that liability if Fire Station 1 went uninsured for so long.
Well, you know, we have Mr. Limita as our operations person for all of the township, and obviously fire is part of our operation in terms of employment, you know, employer of record, so we've got that responsibility already, that he works on contracts, what have you, so that's already in there. Mr. Thomas?
Through you to Attorney Laddie, I'm going to need some help if I form this into a resolution that we disband the agreement and give our 90 days and
Well, let me ask
go
a
with
question.
the township provided services.
How would we move forward, Mr.
Well,
Laddie?
I think the way you should move
Thomas had asked
forward
you?
is very similar to the way we did on the last issue, and that is, we now have the results of this study, which is a piece of the puzzle we've been missing for a long time. And I think that what you need to do is say to the city, we need to discuss our relationship. We need to discuss a reconfiguration of the administration of the fire department. And here's what we're thinking. Number one, we're thinking about, if you are thinking about, the possibility of an interlocal agreement that would reconfigure the administrative representatives, meaning let's just hypothetically envision a fire commission staying at 5 members, but then the city would have 1 member, for example. The budget considerations would, if we had an agreement where they were in partnership with us, they would be able to have budget input, but they wouldn't have a veto power over our budget. I think we need to invite them to consider this idea, if that's one of the ideas you have in mind. The other thing you have to do is offer them an alternative. If you say, we're also looking at the possibility of providing services to you at cost, and we want to have discussion about those 2 possibilities, and see what they say. I think they need to consider the study, even though they've had it for a while, and they need to consider what options you're willing to consider. And if interlocal agreement is one and providing services is the other, I think we should invite them to engage in that discussion.
I think where we're at right now is we've heard a little bit of discussion. I'll call on you next, Mr. Thomas, but I think we've had a little bit of discussion on on the two options, and I guess, before we make a motion, I don't know if we want to get a consensus of where people are at with regard to it, or is that what
No,
you're...
I don't think we need to.
Okay.
Mr.
I'd like,
Uh,
let me make the motion and then
Have
see if it's
discussion.
even seconded, and then we can have discussion, if that's okay.
Okay.
I'd like to make a motion that we give our notice to the city that we're dissolving the agreement and offer them to township-provided services.
Support.
Mr. Laddie, is that appropriate action for moving forward with that particular?
Well, let me read from the agreement, which is the 1990 joint resolution. And its last paragraph says, be it further resolved that in the event of a voluntary dissolution through action by the fire commission or involuntary dissolution through rescission of this resolution by either city or township of Grand Blanc, a written notice shall be prepared and forwarded to the appropriate public officials 90 days prior to the effective date of the action, as well as published in a local newspaper of general circulation 60 days prior to the effective date of the action to adequately provide for an orderly transition to the reporting relationships that existed at the time that this fire commission was established. So it says written notice prepared and forwarded 90 days before the proposed date. So it doesn't take necessarily a resolution, but I know that was a resolution. I know that was seconded, but can I ask you to consider correspondence to them that does not include the resolution to dissolve, and offer them the opportunity to engage us in some discussion about providing services to them?
Yeah, I think
Because
that's
that was the option you offered them in the resolution, right?
Mr. Atkins and then Mr. Buzek.
I appreciate the ad, Mr. Laddie. I'd ask the chair to call for the vote and finish this out and see where it goes. I think that we have seen the response to other issues when we've approached them, and I'm comfortable seeing how this vote carries out. I'd add to, I'd ask Mr. Thomas then if he would just add to that resolution to make it more in line with the language on the agreement. I guess it would be to actually serve a letter of the intent of the 90 days. But other than that, I'd like to see where the vote goes.
I will amend my resolution. Attorney Laddie, so if you could add that to the resolution. You have to.
I will, yep.
What did, Mr. Chair,
Who was a supporter of your motion?
Mr. Atkins?
what did you
I
say,
support
Mr.
Mr. Massey?
Mr. Chair, what did Trustee Thomas say? I didn't understand you, Trustee Thomas.
Maybe Mr. Laddie can reiterate what is being talked about here with the motion.
Yeah, I mean, you're saying basically, let's have the notice comply with the, with the joint resolution that says that written notice shall be prepared and forwarded to the appropriate public officials. And so that's the correspondence that you're referring to, right?
And I'll ask for the vote, but Mr. Laddie, what is your caution? Because I always like to, what's your concern with this motion?
Well, it's only a policy concern, and I'm not a policymaker, right? And so it's clear that resolution calls for a dissolution process, and I'm happy to carry that out. And so I'm gonna withdraw my concern. There's no legal concern for what you just did. It's just a policy concern, and policy is not my place.
Okay. Mr. Massey?
Chair, listening to the attorney in a different language than I'm going to speak, is that I sort of agree with the attorney that if we gave them an opportunity to respond as a joint partner in this, but under one condition, not how they have done in the past. They submit what they think should be part of the joint agreement, not going through the attorneys. That's how they've been procrastinating. So when we present something to our attorney to present something to attorney with Griffin, okay, they'll always say no, but they have never presented anything. They're always saying no to what we present.
Well, here's the dilemma: is that they don't meet for another month, okay, until the middle of February. Mr. Laddie?
Well, I heard that, the first part of that motion that was made was that you would offer to provide services.
Yes.
You're not offering an interlocal agreement.
No.
Right?
No.
Right.
So that wasn't part of what he discussed. He's saying, and so you could do that without sending notice under the dissolution letter. You could say, hey, we're willing to provide you services. You want to participate in that or not?
I just want to make a couple. I'm sorry, Mr. Guzak had his hand up, and then I'll make a couple comments. And Mr. Guzak.
Yeah, I thought what Mr. Laddie said was a good idea, that we could at least submit, because you talked about the agreement's going to be different. They're only going to one person. They don't have veto power. There's a lot of good things in there, and I think it's good to at least discuss it with them. They can get that, and then we can go to the other act if we have to. But I'm agreeing with your first proposal.
Well, a couple of points.
And we're meeting our timeline too. What was your timeline?
April 1st. April 1st.
Right. So we still want to hit that.
I still have the two things in mind. First of all, there's the notice that we're going to dissolve or withdraw from the commission, and then there's the offer for us to provide services.
Right.
Right? I mean, that's what's on the table. A renegotiation of the current agreement is not on the table, and a proposed interlocal agreement is not on the table based on your motion.
Right.
Do I have that right?
A couple of points that I'd just like to make, and I know Mr. Thomas called for the vote, although I didn't hear a second, but.
Mr. Atkins called for it.
Okay, all right. Just, I believe that, we aren't going to see a change in service if we go down this road of offering to sell them service. Nothing says that they will take that offer. They're obviously looking out for their residents, and they're going to do what is in their best interest. But if they were to elect to purchase services from us, I wouldn't see any change in service. I think it's more of a change in the governance model, really. That service, in terms of staying in Station 1, even though I think that probably, it may be outdated in terms of some of the new equipment we're going to be bringing in. But really, some of the concerns that they voiced are valid in terms of our future growth in the township. We're hopefully on the verge of some very exciting things happening in our township growth-wise. All those aren't public, but bottom line is we have a DDA that is working very hard. We have a proposed technology village that we're working hard to market and to see development happen. We have to be nimble in terms of how we position. We're up against other municipalities in many cases, and a business moves into our township and they want to know, how is the fire service here? If we build XYZ company, are we going to have the kind of service we need? We need to be able to respond and say, absolutely, Fire Station 3, we're going to start manning that. Under the current scenario, we would have a long drawn out discussion, and it took us 2 years to get this millage increase. How long it would take to talk about expanding, I'm not sure how long that discussion would take. Bottom line is that this way of doing things would make us much more nimble. It would also result in city residents not having to pay for our growth. I know that was one of the concerns that the city council has brought up numerous times, that they were not going to fund the township's expansion or growth with regard to fire requirements. So this would, and obviously the study shows that where those cost allocations are coming from, and would in the future as well. Just a couple other quick points, and then Mr. Massey. I think it's mainly a governance change. I don't really see the service model. We're going to continue to have full-time with, paid on call. We're going to still provide great service to every resident that chooses to use our service, which everybody in the township would, and the city, it'd be up to them. But I don't think we can kick the can down the road anymore. We've spent countless meetings, not just this board, but prior boards, and we have a lot that we set up as goals that we want to achieve here. And I just see that if we have any kind of joint agreement, we're going to still be at this table discussing every time we have a small project, whether it's a kitchen or needing to add a staff person or what have you. And so I really think this will allow us to be nimble and to remove a lot of, I mean, previously this board, before we had Mr. Limita, we spent a lot of times on personnel issues, what have you. We've directed operational issues to Mr. Limita, and I foresee the same kind of thing happening with fire. As a lot of the things we're discussing at this board table could be easily handled with our CEO or our superintendent that takes care of daily operations. So I'm looking forward to being able to spend our time on a lot of other issues and have this fall under operations. Mr. Massey, and then we're going to go to Mr. Laddie.
I do have one point.
Sure.
Mr. Massey.
I would like to raise the issue that the attorney raised months ago when we first really openly started talking about the agreement, the joint agreement. Keep in mind, I'd like for all my board members to keep in mind that regardless what the outcome is, we still gonna have to provide some kind of fire service for some unknown extended period of time. I just want that to be known.
Well,
Yeah.
sure. I mean, that is absolutely true. No one's going to be left high and dry. And under the concept, let's say that our motion moves forward, you guys anticipate a pretty detailed in a written agreement that lays out our responsibilities to them and lays out their obligation to pay for those services. And you don't anticipate any disruption in service or any drop in service levels. And we'll have to figure out a way to identify the level of service that we're providing. Well, I think we've got a pretty good example of it here. But there's commitment on our part for them, for however long we both agree to have that run for, whatever iteration that takes, whether that involves some sort of understanding regarding Fire Station 1 or not, and we'll have to consider those issues, but we're willing to make this a long-term, secure agreement for the city and the residents. And also, to Mr. Massey's point, if they decline our offer, then we're going to have to explore the possibilities of that also. And nobody's going to be left without fire service. That's the bottom line. This issue will be resolved with public safety at the forefront. And there won't be no decrease in service, however it turns out, until we decide what direction we're going.
Mr. Mansour?
So I'd just like to make a quick comment here. First off, I think that last point that Attorney Laddie made about leading off, or at least making that a prominent issue, that we're not going to leave high and dry anyone in the community here for community service. I mean, we already are, we share our services with people outside the community anyway, so we're certainly going to do it inside. And the other point is, it just escaped me.
Well, let's go to Mr. Gruzak and then we come back. Mr. Gruzak?
Yeah, and I agree with everything that Supervisor has said, but I still think we can meet the timeline and have this completed by April and still go with Attorney Laddie's first proposal. I mean, I agree with everything that's being said, but I think if we structure it the proper way, if they don't accept it, that's fine, but at least we've looked at all the options, and I know it's been 3 years, I know that, but if we can still hit the timeline of getting this done in April, I'm willing, that's why I would probably be voting no against this, because I think we should at least look at that option.
Mr. Mansour, did you think?
And I see that point as well, and that was actually the first thing to cross my mind too, is that why not give this a chance to try and make it a new interlocal agreement that's more organized, and that we could work in a more effective, streamlined way here. But this has been going on for so long that it certainly wouldn't surprise me if in fact the city hasn't already taken a look at their options and maybe looked for outside places to get their service from. So that wouldn't surprise me at all.
They have.
All right. Maybe they already have, is right. And from what we're hearing, they may have. So, okay. Well, Mr. Adkins called for the vote some time ago. And Mr. Laddie, would you suggest this a resolution or just a straight up vote?
No, I think it's just a straight up vote.
Okay.
It
All
doesn't need
in-
to be a resolution according to
Okay. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Okay.
Mr. Supervisor.
So, Mr. Laddie, you will correspond with the city on this issue, and
I will. I will have some discussion with Superintendent Limita regarding the appropriate public official and this correspondence, and I'll certainly forward to them what we just decided tonight.
okay.
Mr. Supervisor.
Yes.
I was just kidding about making Mr. Kilmer sit through this.
Oh,
We
well, no,
moved him up to operations one.
No, we moved it up to the first item under operational issues. So with that, I would ask the board to consider to approve Mr. Kilmer, Mark Kilmer, as township representative for the unexpired term of Miss Pat DeMarco, and that lasts through December of 2019.
I'll make the motion.
That's so move.
Okay. First off, I'd just like to mention that I believe this board needs to recognize Ms. DeMarco. She's spent a great deal of time on the board as treasurer and been a real asset to our community. So I would like just to, I'll make sure we make contact with her and invite her to one of our upcoming board meetings to recognize her efforts. Mr. Kilmer, would you like to say a few words? Come on up to the podium if you would. I know you probably had a long speech prepared, but feel free to abbreviate it.
Fell asleep and forgot it. Most of you know me pretty well. Some of you don't. I've been 35 plus years as in the construction industry, and as a manufacturer's rep, contractor, specifier, 2 terms as president of the local chapter of CSI. Hundreds of continuing education seminars for architects in all 50 states. I've done a lot of local projects, Bishop Airport, Chrysler Arena, the Mazda plant, which was the largest in the world at that time, Pistons Palace, General Dynamics. I've done a lot of schools, libraries, worked with the state of Michigan. The last thing that I did was the Penguin House project at the Detroit Zoo. I understand that most of this position involves maintenance and planning and determining what the library needs. And I think I have a reasonably good background to do that. And I look forward to working with you.
And Mr. Kilmer, I appreciate you coming to us, even months ago, offering to volunteer to assist our township in any manner possible. And I think your background, we're in the midst right now of asking a firm to kind of give us an assessment of what are the physical plant needs over the next 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to get that information, and we
I
probably
ask-
want to make you part of that.
Is that
We've
Cooper?
asked Cooper Properties to help us with that, and so they've agreed to assist us.
Great.
And so the bottom line is that I think you would be an asset to our McFarland Library Board and to this board as well, because we're looking at the cost analysis that we've heard so far is substantial. An investment that would need to be made over the next several years. So I think your assistance would be great. And I think one of the things we want to do is improve our communication with with the library board. And so we just ask that we're going to be in touch, you and I, and
Certainly.
that we continue to help the library.
Great.
Okay. Any questions for Mr. Kilmer?
No, welcome aboard.
Thank you.
Glad
Yeah.
you're volunteering.
Gotta make a motion.
There's been a motion.
I'll make the motion.
It's already
Second.
been
It's already been
made.
second, yeah.
Okay. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Congratulations, Mr. Kilmer. Let's find out from the board
I gotta use
if anybody needs a 5-minute break.
Sure.
All right, we will reconvene in 5 minutes. Ask that we reconvene our board meeting after this brief break that we had.
In the break, I talked with Mr. Laddie briefly, and there's an additional resolution that I believe that we need to consider with regard to our action on the fire. Mr. Laddie?
There is, and again, your motion talked about the preparation and delivery of written notice pursuant to the paragraph in the agreement, but there's also a requirement that I want to make sure that we meet, and that is that the language says, in the event of a voluntary dissolution through action of the Fire Commission, or involuntary dissolution, rescission of this resolution by either city or township of Grand Blanc. And so I think we should probably, if we want to invoke that provision, we should probably pass a resolution that rescinds this joint resolution that was adopted in 1990. Same provision I read from earlier, just a formal resolution rescinding that resolution.
So our current...
I'll make that resolution.
I'm sorry?
I'll make that resolution.
Okay.
Support.
Okay. Any further discussion? It's a resolution. Ms. Lane?
Yes. Mr. Massey?
Yes.
Mr. Atkins?
Yes.
Mr. Mansour?
Yes.
Mr. Thomas?
Yes.
Mr. Gusak?
Yes, and the only reason I'm yes is because this is protecting the township.
Myself, yes. And
We don't need an
Supervisor.
explanation.
Well, you put
Okay,
your 2 cents in anytime you
let's-
want, why
hey,
can't I?
Let's limit it here. If you want to speak, you need to ask the chair here, just so it doesn't get out of hand. And yes,
Yes, thank you.
okay.
Thank you.
All right. So with that, we'll move on to our next agenda item. And let's see, we moved some things around, so the board will consider a motion to adopt the new procedure for authorizing projects for parks and recreation capital expenditures that resulted from the value stream mapping exercise.
I'll make the motion.
I'll support.
Any discussion?
Yeah,
All's in favor?
I want to say thank you to Trustee Atkins for doing a great job on that and his task force that helped.
And yes, I would ditto that comment.
Thanks.
It was a full day of being here and then probably a couple more days of work after here, so.
Thank you, thank you.
So thank you, Mr. Atkins, for even bringing that idea to our board. So all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the next item on their agenda is the board will consider a resolution to approve a public hearing date of March 14th, 2019 for the purpose of hearing comments on the proposed DDA and TIF plans.
I will so move on the resolution.
Support.
Support? Mr. Laddie, would you like to
Call for the order.
discuss that
Just
at all?
briefly, the DDA Board of Directors has adopted an amended development plan and TIF plan that are combined into one. They did adopt it, and they will forward it to you, but also they need to make sure that a public hearing is held by March 14th, which is basically our last date to meet notice requirements pursuant to the statute. And so what you will see is you'll probably get a copy beforehand. You'll get a copy of what they currently have adopted. And I anticipate at their February meeting, they will probably make further amendments to that plan. And so while we'll provide you with that plan to take a look at, the final version will come to you after their February meeting date. And so what this will do is this will potentially convert those plans into ordinances and get everything in place.
While we're on this topic of the DDA and this resolution, I know it is apart from this, but that DDA board also, which I serve on because of being supervisor, is going to be coming to this board to ask for some financial assistance in terms of a loan. Is that going to be coming in beginning of February, we believe?
They are, and they made a request, and what I think I'll do is I'll forward their request to you and Superintendent Lemata, and you can
Forward it to our board?
break the news to your...
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, we want the DDA to be successful, and in order to get started on some things, we have to have some funding. I mean, for starters, Mr. Laddie, I mean, we talked about, separate entities and authorities and what have you, and the DDA is a separate authority, right, or a separate entity, separate board. Mr. Laddie right now actually is volunteering his time for the DDA, and you know, while that's great, we don't expect everybody else to volunteer for our DDA, and there's going to be professionals that we need to hire and contract with in order to get this thing rolling. We've already contracted with Rowe Engineering to put together the plan, but we want to move quickly and adeptly, and we don't want this to falter because they can't move forward because of financial constraints. So I believe the ask is going to be significant enough to get them through the first couple of years would be my suggestion. Mr. Thomas?
Would, through you to Supervisor Bennett, would Mr. Attorney Laddie want to be volunteering his, they would end up hiring Attorney Laddie for their attorney on record, wouldn't they?
Well, the board would be the one to do that, but I'm assuming with Mr. Laddie, you know, providing lots of resources for them.
Lots and lots and lots of resources.
Right.
But
I'm finally being paid when I work.
We have asked.
No, I really want to bring this up because when we were going through the budget and we were looking at what we are paying our corporate counsel, it's
well, Mr. Atkins?
Yeah, I mean, this
Not
comes as no surprise. Mr. Laddie informed us when we first formed this that they would need some sort of seed money at some point, and I think it's a great addition to the community, and I think it'd be really good to get them off the ground and running and self-sustaining with some resources they need, so.
Right, okay, so that ask is going to be coming in the next couple of weeks here. Okay, with that, we have a resolution here for us.
Mr. Mansour?
Yes.
Mr. Thomas?
Yes.
Mr. Atkins?
Yes.
Mr. Guzak?
Yes.
Mr. Massey?
Yes.
Myself, yes. Mr. Supervisor?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Next item on the agenda is the board will consider a resolution to approve the removal from the tax roll for the tax year 2018 the following parcels that were foreclosed and transferred to the Genesee County Land Bank Authority. I'm not sure I've got to read the numbers for each of those, but they're on the printed agenda.
So move, Mr. Chairman.
Support.
Okay. Just a brief discussion. It was Mr. Atkins that supported.
Thank you.
The just note here, these are three that are going off, and actually the same organization, the Genesee County Land Bank Authority, I was informed, is actually adding 140 back onto our rolls. Is that accurate, Mr. Limita, that's what we're hearing?
Yeah, that's what Becky told us, is that the assessing department, even though we've got 3 coming off, and that sounds bad, oh no, we're losing 3 properties off the tax roll. There was 140 properties that came back on the tax roll, so I think we're gonna be okay.
Wow. So
They came back on.
we'll look for a blip on our taxable value because of that. Instead of 1.5 billion, you know, we'll add a few to that.
Imperceptible.
Okay, so is there a motion to?
It's been made and supported, Mr.
Okay,
Chair.
all those in favor?
Aye.
It's a resolution, okay.
Mr. Mansour?
Yes.
Mr. Thomas?
Yes.
Mr. Atkins?
Yes.
Mr. Guzak?
Yes.
Mr. Massey?
Yes.
Myself, yes. Mr. Supervisor?
Okay, one thing I just wanted to, this is not on the agenda, but I received it in the mail today, and it is the agreement with Plant Moran to do our audit. We've been with them for 29 years. If this is something that we want to look at in the future in terms of bidding out, we need to do it in June, because you know, the law states that we have got to get started on this audit immediately for this past year. So I just wanted to inform the board that in the past, you know, the supervisor has signed these, but is there any objection? I mean, we have to move forward on it. I mean, we can't at this point. In the future, if we want to consider other firms doing the audit, we need to make that determination during the summer when we have time to do all the homework on the various auditing firms. So, Mr. Mansour?
Yep, two things. Could we put that into the calendar for next summer, or this summer?
To consider?
To consider, so that we don't let it slip until we're forced into a corner. So if we can put that on the calendar, that would be great.
Or like May or June to start looking at
Yeah.
that?
Yep.
Okay.
But Mr. Chair, question.
Yes.
Isn't that the superintendent's responsibility?
Bless you.
Well, the audit, I'm not sure where that falls, but it's probably more of a board issue, Mr. Limita, or, I mean,
I mean, it's really operational. It's one of those things where they've been coming here for nearly 30 years, right? It's one of those things where, again, it's a competitive negotiation, not just strictly an RFP. Can we get our audit done cheaper? Absolutely. Will it be as complete and as, have the veracity of the ones that we receive now? Sure, maybe. I mean, it's worth looking at. You just have to look at some RFQs. You bring people in. It's no different than health insurers or anything else. You bring them in, you interview them. It's just that if the board wants to take a look at it, we just want to make it that we get it out there soon enough by June, so that by the time they're in here giving you your audit results of 2018, we're already going to be out there doing RFQs to bring. So at least we can explore the options.
I appreciate that we haven't had to decide on this. We've had plenty on our plate over the past few months, Mr. Mansour.
So I think when we did something with the agenda, we thought that we might add a on-base quick description here, so we could be ready for the 14th.
That was the last item on the
sorry.
agenda, but.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, thanks for reminding me of that. Mr. Limita, the on-base software that we had on the agenda under the consent agenda, it was basically that we'd consider a motion to approve the annual renewal maintenance, and we pulled that out of the consent agenda, and I just wanted to briefly discuss that in terms of why, what's going on here with the contract dates and how we're merging a couple different contracts apparently together.
So we had it in the consent agenda because it's just a maintenance agreement. I don't think there's any consideration that the board is not going to approve our maintenance agreement for the on-base software that we just purchased and installed within the last 12 months. It's more the fact that Trustee Mansour had asked about the dates being on the invoice so that it was very clear what the period was covered. It's an annual thing. We installed it, but they combined two separate software packages that we bought. This is the annual maintenance. So when I asked, based upon Trustee Mansour's request, to them put the dates on it, they came back and said, okay, make it from March 1st through December 28th of 19, even though there's one of them that goes till March and the other one, it was just confusing. So I think what they're trying to do is consolidate, so much like we did with BSNA a year or two ago, where we have them all coming due at different dates for our maintenance agreements on our software, is we ask them to prorate them and get them all on the same date so the board can approve them at one time and move forward. We'd like to have AM Data Services do the exact same thing here. And because of the confusion today when Director Beller was trying to get it cleared up, I think it does make sense for the board to delay it till February and have so that it's spelled it on the invoice. We'll go ahead and have them separated. We'll prorate it. We'll do what we do so that they all come due. And it's truly an annualized basis. They'll come due in January of 2020.
Okay. All right.
One more item,
yes.
if I could. Did we vote on the Plant Moran?
No, but I'm asking for consensus if it's okay if I sign.
Oh, yeah, fine.
Is everybody in agreement? Does anybody object to me signing the agreement with Plant Moran?
No.
And we'll put it on the agenda for June or May or what have you to revisit how we select our auditing firm and go from there. Ms. Lane?
I would prefer that this is to do 2018's audit, and it's a contract, and my suggestion is that it be a motion with an amount saying it's for 2018, with the other discussions being something you want done, but it's a contract, and
the amount isn't in here. But Mr. Laddie, what do you suggest? I mean,
I think we've always just kind of signed it, move forward, because we have a long-term agreement with them. And so you're engaging them for the year. It would be too late for you to change at this point. The dollar amount isn't in there, although we put the dollar amount based into the budget based on where we think it's going to be, because it does have something to do with time and materials, obviously.
Right.
how quick they can get through the audit, but we know.
It's in the budget already. I mean,
If I remember right, wasn't it 2 years ago, or last year that we signed a 3-year agreement? Or 2 years ago we signed a 3-year agreement?
No, this is basically like the letter of engagement saying from the supervisor that, yes, we are engaging you for audit services again.
But isn't it a 3-year agreement?
No, this is just, it was competitive negotiation. These guys are our auditors. They have been our auditors. We just engage them every year to conduct our audit services, and that's what that is. Until such time as we don't engage them to conduct our audit services.
Do you have the budget real quick where we could just pull that number up real quick and just vote on it?
It's not just a dollar amount there, it's in the DPW, it's in the general fund, it's
spread out throughout the budget. It sounds like, I don't know, might not be unanimous, but I'm hearing consensus. Ms. Lane?
I would be willing to make the motion authorizing you to sign the contract for Plant Moran to do the 2018 audit for the township.
Support.
Okay. All's in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. All right. Be prepared for possibly a board meeting. All as I'm thinking is that we talked about having a separate board meeting to go through the park agreement, and so I mean we're going to probably be doing that fairly soon. So with that, Mr. Mansour,
I'd like to make a motion to adjourn.
Support.
all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you, everyone.
Guys.
Saved a half an hour off of this baby.
Right.